Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles in gently, science takes the long way round, and the ancient world gets to speak at the pace of a quiet evening. Tonight, we're going to Sardinia, to a wide-open stretch of land near Sassari, where the air is bright, the ground is dry, and one of the strangest prehistoric monuments in Europe rises from the earth like a memory that wandered in from somewhere else. It is called Monte, and at first glance it does not look entirely European. It looks like something that should belong much farther east, somewhere near the old river valleys of Mesopotamia, where stepped platforms and temple towers once lifted human prayers toward the sky. And yet, this structure is not in Iraq, not in Syria, not beside the Tigris or the Euphrates. It is on a Mediterranean island in northern Sardinia, sitting calmly in the landscape as if it has always known exactly where it belongs. Before we walk up that long ancient ramp together, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from tonight. Are you somewhere close to the sea, perhaps with the faint smell of rain outside, or tucked away in a city where the evening has gone quiet at last? And here is a slightly stranger question for you, fitting for tonight's mystery. Have you ever seen something that felt out of place, not wrong exactly, but unexpected, as if history had quietly placed a puzzle piece where no one thought to look? A building, a stone, an old road, a ruin on a hillside, something that made you pause and think, well, that's not supposed to be here. Monte has that effect. It stands there not with drama, not with noise, but with the quiet confidence of an object that has been confusing people for several thousand years. If you find this little journey soothing, intriguing, or just the right amount of ancient and mysterious for a sleepy mind, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this calm corner of curiosity reach other travellers who might enjoy drifting through old stones, forgotten cultures, and the occasional archaeological question that refuses to sit neatly in a box. And tonight's question is wonderfully stubborn. What is a monument shaped like a great raised altar, with a long ramp and a broad platform, doing in prehistoric Sardinia? Why does it remind so many people of the ziggurats of the ancient Near East? And why, after decades of study, does it still seem to keep part of itself hidden, rather politely, like a guest at dinner who knows a fascinating story, but waits until everyone is comfortable before telling it? Monte is often described as unique in Sardinia, and even unique in the Western Mediterranean. The official archaeological description identifies the main monument as a terrace altar, in the form of a truncated pyramid, roughly rectangular, standing around 10 metres high today, and reached by a ramp about 42 metres long. It was built at the beginning of the Copper Age, but it also incorporated an older sanctuary beneath it, meaning that the place was important before the monument we see now fully took shape. That is already enough to make the site remarkable. But facts alone do not capture the odd feeling of it. Many ruins are old, many are sacred, many are difficult to interpret. Monte is all of those things, but it is also visually surprising. It does not behave like the other prehistoric structures most people associate with Western Europe. It is not a stone circle. It is not a dolmen, it is not a chamber tomb tucked into a hill, nor a ring of standing stones waiting patiently for sunrise. It is a platform, a raised place. A built-up sacred height where human feet once climbed above the ordinary ground. There is something very human about wanting to rise just a little. Not fly, not escape the world completely, just step upward. A mound, a platform, a hill, a tower, a stairway. Across cultures, people have often built sacred places with height in mind. Perhaps because the sky feels farther from our problems. Perhaps because ceremonies seem more official when everyone has to climb something first. Even today, a few steps can change how a place feels. A stage turns a speaker into a performer. A courthouse stairway turns a building into an institution. A hilltop makes a small chapel feel like it has a private arrangement with the clouds. At Monte that impulse was made in stone and earth. People gathered material, carried it, shaped it, packed it, raised it, and then came back to it again and again. They did this thousands of years before Sardinia's famous nuraghi, those great Bronze Age stone towers that now dominate the island's prehistoric imagination. Monte da Codi belongs to an older world, a pre-nuragic world, when farming communities, ritual landscapes, decorated pottery, and ancestor memory were gradually changing the island. And here, it is worth slowing down. Because when people hear that Monte da Codi looks a little like a Mesopotamian ziggurat, it is tempting to leap straight into wild conclusions. Ancient travellers, lost priests, forgotten colonies, people bringing temple architecture across the sea with suspiciously good luggage. The human mind loves a shortcut, especially when that shortcut includes a dramatic map and a dotted line across the Mediterranean. But archaeology asks us to move more carefully. Similar shapes do not always mean direct contact. People in different places can arrive at similar ideas because they face similar questions. How do you mark a sacred place? How do you gather a community? How do you create a point between earth and sky? How do you make a structure that says, without writing a single word, this place matters? A raised platform is one possible answer. It is simple, powerful, and very hard to ignore, which is useful if your monument is supposed to be seen by people, ancestors, gods, spirits, or possibly all of the above. Still, the resemblance is hard to miss. A broad base, a long ramp, a high terrace, a sense of ascent. This is why Monte da Codi has gathered so many comparisons to the temple platforms of Mesopotamia, even though it stands in a very different cultural world. The site has been discussed as an altar, a temple, a step pyramid, and a ziggurat-like monument, and the debate over its meaning has continued because it does not fit easily into the familiar categories of prehistoric Europe. The regional cultural source from Sardinia describes it as a large trunk pyramidal terrace with a long trapezoidal access ramp, built with limestone blocks and filled with layers of earth and stone, and calls it unique on the island and in the Western Mediterranean. That word unique can be overused in travel brochures. Every town square is unique if you ask it politely. But here, the word has weight. Monte da Codi really does sit in a category of its own. The monument was not discovered by modern archaeology in some dramatic desert expedition with hats, notebooks, and someone brushing sand from an inscription at sunset. It was identified in the 20th century in farmland, a reminder that the ancient world often survives not in remote temples, but beneath ordinary fields, waiting under places where people work, walk, and wonder why the ground rises oddly in one corner. The site was discovered in 1954 in land belonging to the Segni family, and later excavations revealed the unusual structure beneath the mound. There is something quietly funny about that. You think you have a field, maybe a difficult field, perhaps one with too many stones and not enough cooperation, and then it turns out to be one of the most extraordinary prehistoric ritual monuments in the Mediterranean. It is the sort of discovery that makes you look at any small hill with a little more respect. Even the lump behind the garden shed begins to seem suspiciously meaningful. But Monte da Codi is not just strange because of its shape. It is strange because of its timing. The roots of the site reach back into the 4th millennium BCE, long before the classical world, long before Rome, long before the nuraghi, long before the Mediterranean became the crowded theatre of ships, empires, alphabets, and trade routes that many of us picture when we think of ancient history. Recent radiocarbon work has helped refine the chronology of the site, showing a long sequence of activity from the Neolithic into the Copper Age and beyond. So when we speak of Monte da Codi, we're not speaking of a single moment. We're speaking of layers, an earlier sacred place, then a larger rebuilding, then continued memory, return, reuse, and perhaps reinterpretation by people who came later. Ancient places are rarely still. Even when the stones do not move, their meanings do. Imagine the plain before the monument existed. Not empty, because landscapes are almost never empty to the people who know them. There would have been paths, fields, animals, seasonal movement, family memory, burial places, familiar stones, water sources, lines of sight toward hills and sky. Then, at some point, people began to mark one place more strongly than the others. Perhaps the choice was practical. Perhaps it had older meaning. Perhaps something had happened there, something remembered long enough to become important. We do not know. Archaeology is very good at giving us objects, dates, patterns, and structures. It is less generous with conversations. The people who built Monte did not leave us a convenient note saying, "Dear future viewers, this is exactly what we meant." Ancient people almost never do, which is inconsiderate but understandable. So we look at what remains: a raised monument, a ramp, associated ritual areas, traces of settlement around it, objects that suggest ceremony, offerings, domestic life, and the complicated blending of daily and sacred activity. The official site describes the monument as surrounded by remains of a village and spaces connected with rituals and the memory of the dead. That matters. A sacred monument is not just a shape in isolation, it is part of a lived world. People came there with bodies, with food, with worries, with children, with animals, with grief, with hopes for weather, harvest, fertility, health, ancestry, or whatever forces they believed held the world together. We may not know the prayers, but we can see the effort. Effort is one of archaeology's clearest languages. When a community moves earth and stone at this scale, it is telling us that something mattered enough to organise labour, enough to return, enough to build over what came before rather than simply abandon it. There is a gentle trap in the title of tonight's story, of course. This ancient structure doesn't belong in Europe, but it does. The first half is the feeling. The second half is the truth. Monte may look unexpected, but it is not an intruder. It is Sardinian. It belongs to the island's long prehistoric story, to the communities who lived there, to the Mediterranean world where ideas, materials and symbols could move in ways we are still trying to understand. It belongs because the people who built it belonged. They were not confused Europeans accidentally making a Near Eastern monument. They were skilled prehistoric islanders creating something meaningful in their own setting. The fact that it reminds us of places far away may say as much about our categories as it does about their intentions. Europe's prehistory is often presented in tidy regional boxes. Here are the megalith builders, here are the farmers, here are the copper users, here are the burial cultures, here are the island societies. But real human life has never been tidy. Sardinia sits in the Mediterranean, and islands are never just isolated dots on maps. They are homes, harbours, barriers, bridges, refuges, meeting points. The sea can separate, yes, but it can also connect. Long before written history, people moved obsidian, shells, pottery styles, animals, technologies and ideas across surprising distances. Sardinia itself was known in prehistory for obsidian sources, and obsidian travelled widely because sharp volcanic glass is a very persuasive material. If you've ever tried to cut a tomato with a dull knife, you will understand why ancient communities valued good cutting tools, though perhaps they expressed it with more dignity. So Monte invites a careful kind of wonder. Not the wonder that immediately invents an answer, but the wonder that sits with the evidence and lets the mystery remain productive. Was it influenced by distant ideas? Perhaps. Did it arise independently from local traditions? Also possible. Did its builders intend it as an altar, a temple, a symbolic mountain, a place of offerings, a ceremonial centre, or something that does not fit any modern word neatly? Very possibly. The trouble is not that we have no clues. The trouble is that the clues are rich enough to support more than one thoughtful interpretation. And in archaeology, that is often where the most interesting thinking begins. One of the loveliest things about Monte is that it does not need to be exaggerated to be fascinating. It does not require aliens, lost continents, or secret codes carved by people with suspiciously modern knowledge. It is already strange enough. A monumental terrace in Neolithic and Copper Age Sardinia, built and rebuilt, aligned and approached, remembered and debated. standing in the western Mediterranean with a shape that makes scholars glance eastward and then back again with raised eyebrows. That is more than enough. The real past is rarely boring. It only becomes boring when we flatten it into dates and labels and forget that every structure was made by hands, every ritual performed by living people, every stone placed in weather, sweat, conversation, and probably at least one person saying the prehistoric equivalent of, "Are we sure this is level?" As we begin, it helps to picture the site not as a ruined object, but as an experience. You're walking across open ground. The monument does not tower like a cathedral, but it rises with deliberate mass. The ramp leads upward, not steeply like a mountain path, but with ceremony. A ramp is a very different thing from a staircase. A staircase makes you climb step by step. A ramp lets movement become procession. It allows people, animals, offerings and objects to move together. It slows the body without stopping it. It says, "Come forward gradually." Leave the ordinary level behind, not all at once, but carefully. That gradual rise may have been part of the meaning. Sacred space often begins before the ceremony does. It begins in the approach. And the name itself, Monte da Codi, has become attached to a monument that is not really a mountain in the natural sense. It is a made height, a constructed elevation. That difference matters. A natural hill may become sacred because it is already there, already impressive, already pointing upward. But an artificial mound tells another story. It says people decided to make height. They did not merely find a raised place, they created one. They turned effort into landscape. They made architecture out of Earth's own material, as if building a hill that could be used, visited and remembered. Tonight, then, we are not simply visiting an archaeological site. We are entering a question built from stone and soil. We are going to look at a monument that seems foreign and local at the same time. Simple in shape and difficult in meaning. Ancient beyond easy imagination, and yet still present enough that modern visitors can stand before it and feel the same small pause humans have always felt before places made for something larger than daily life. Monte da Codi does not shout its mystery. It rests in the Sardinian landscape, sunlit and patient, letting us notice its ramp, its platform, its unlikely resemblance, and the long silence around its builders. And as we move closer, the first thing to understand is not the theory, not the comparison, not even the debate. It is the physical thing itself, the strange stone platform in Sardinia, and the way it rises from the plain, as if Europe briefly remembered a different architectural dream. The first thing Monte da Codi asks of you is not to understand it, but simply to look at it for a while. That sounds easy enough until you realise that the structure does not quite behave like the ancient monuments your mind may be expecting. It is not a circle of stones standing in a misty field. It is not a tomb hidden in a hillside. It is not one of Sardinia's later nuraghi, those heavy Bronze Age towers that look as if the island itself decided to build fortresses. Monte da Codi is lower, broader, stranger. It rises from the ground as a wide, blunt mass of stone and earth, with a long ramp leading upward toward a flat terrace. It has the practical confidence of a building made for use, but the quiet strangeness of a place made for something more than practical life. In other words, it looks like a platform, but behaves like a question. The site sits in northwestern Sardinia, near Sassari, on the edge of the Nura Plain, in a landscape that has been lived in, farmed, crossed and remembered for thousands of years. The official site describes Monte da Codi as a prehistoric sanctuary that brings together superimposed altars, huts, sacred stones and burials in one location, and places it within a long sequence of occupation from the Neolithic to the early Bronze Age. The main monument visible today is described as a terrace altar in the shape of a truncated pyramid, approximately 37 by 30 metres, about 10 metres high today, reached by a ramp around 42 metres long. That is a tidy description, and archaeology often needs tidy descriptions because otherwise every report would become a long sigh, followed by the words, "Well, it's complicated." But standing before it, or even imagining yourself standing before it, the numbers become something more physical. 37 meters is not just a measurement. It is a space large enough to make the human body feel small. 42 meters of ramp is not just an architectural feature. It is a deliberate approach, a stretch of movement, a slow transition from one level of the world to another. The ramp is perhaps the most important clue to the feeling of the place. A platform without a ramp can be merely a block. A platform with a ramp becomes an invitation. It tells the body where to go. It shapes movement. It creates direction. You do not simply arrive at the top, you are drawn toward it. And because a ramp is gradual, it changes the experience of approach. There is no sudden climb, no dramatic staircase, no forced rhythm of steps. Instead, there is a steady rise, gentle enough for a procession, for carried objects, for people moving together. You can imagine a line of figures crossing the ground, then beginning to ascend, not hurriedly, not casually either, but in that slower pace humans tend to adopt when they know they're entering a place that matters. Even today, when we have little idea what words were spoken there, the ramp still tells us something. It says that movement was part of the meaning. The structure itself is often called an altar, and that word can make the mind jump quickly to sacrifice, ceremony, smoke, offerings, and all the familiar furniture of sacred imagination. But it is worth being careful. The word altar is useful, but it is also modern. It comes with expectations. We use it because the monument seems to have served a ritual function, and because the site includes features that suggest offerings and sacred activity. The surrounding complex includes a village and a hypogeic necropolis, and Sardinia Cultura describes the altar as unique on the island and in the western Mediterranean. Built with irregular rows of large limestone blocks and filled with layers of earth and stones. That layered filling is important because Monte was not carved from a single natural hill. It was made. Human beings built height out of material. They shaped a raised place where no such place had existed in quite that form before. There is something almost stubborn about that act. A community looked at the land and decided it needed a constructed high point. Not a tower, not a wall, not a house, but a terrace. They gathered stone, earth, and limestone blocks. They stacked and packed and arranged them. They faced the outside with masonry. They built not merely for shelter, because no one needed a structure like this to stay out of the rain. They built to create a setting. And that may be one of the simplest ways to think about Monte at first. It is a setting for actions. A stage, if we are careful with the word, not a stage for entertainment unless the ancient gods had a surprisingly demanding performance schedule, but a raised place where acts could be seen, repeated, remembered, and made official by the fact that they happened there. The monument we see today is not the first version of the sacred place. Beneath the larger structure was an earlier altar, often called the Red Temple because of the red ochre used on its plaster and floor. Sardinia Cultura describes this previous altar as a smaller quadrangular terrace with its own ramp, and says that on top of it stood a rectangular chapel plastered with ochre, with preserved floor and portions of wall. That detail changes the site from a single strange object into a story of rebuilding. People did not just come once, build once, and leave. They returned. They changed the form. They covered an older sacred structure with a newer and larger one, preserving it inside the monument like a memory sealed into architecture. This is one of those archaeological facts that feels almost intimate. Beneath the visible platform is another place, older, smaller, red with pigment folded into the later construction. Red ochre itself has a deep prehistoric history. It appears in burials, paintings, body decoration, and ritual contexts across many parts of the ancient world. We should not assume it always meant the same thing, because symbols are very poorly behaved over thousands of years, but red is hard to ignore. It can suggest blood, life, earth, heat, transformation, or simply colour with power. At Monte the name Red Temple comes from its physical traces, not from a recovered myth. We do not know what the builders called it. We do not know whether they thought of it as red in a symbolic way, or simply used a pigment that had meaning within their own traditions. Still, the image is strong. Before the large stone platform, before the form that makes visitors think of distant ziggurats, there was a smaller sacred structure with red plastered surfaces, reached by a ramp standing among the lives of Neolithic people. When the later monument was built, the earlier one was not erased in the ordinary sense, it was incorporated. That may sound like a technical phrase, but it carries a great deal of human meaning. To incorporate an older sanctuary into a new monument is to say that the old place still matters. It is not discarded rubble. It becomes the heart or memory of the new structure. It is a little like building a new church over an older chapel, or placing a family heirloom inside the wall of a new home. The object is hidden, but not forgotten. It becomes part of the authority of the building. At Monte the later great stepped altar seems to have grown around the older sacred place, making the monument not just taller and broader, but deeper in time. The shape of the later platform gives it its unusual presence. It is often described as truncated pyramidal, which is not a phrase one normally hears in relaxed conversation. If someone says truncated pyramid at dinner, they're either an archaeologist, an architect, or someone who has been asked to describe a cake that went badly wrong. But the phrase is useful. It means a pyramid form whose top has been cut off, leaving a flat surface rather than a point. Monte does not rise to a sharp peak. It rises to a usable terrace. That flat top is what makes it feel less like a monument to be admired from below, and more like a place where something happened above. The top was not just the end of the structure, it was its purpose. The official site suggests that on top of the platform there may have been a rectangular hall with a gabled roof, intended for collective ceremonies. It also notes that at the foot of the ramp stood a large menhir nearly 4.5 meters high, along with stone slabs likely used as offering tables and spheroidal blocks with cup marks, all emphasizing the sacred nature of the area. That means the platform was not alone. The ramp and terrace were part of a larger sacred arrangement, a tall standing stone, offering slabs, rounded stones marked with small hollows, nearby huts, burials in the broader landscape. Taken together, these features make the site feel less like one isolated building and more like a ritual field, a place where different kinds of memory and ceremony gathered around the central raised form. The menhir deserves a moment of its own. A standing stone nearly 4.5 meters high is not something people casually misplace. It required selection, transport, placement, and the confidence that upright stones should remain upright, which is an ancient human opinion found in many parts of the world. Near Monte the menhir adds a vertical note beside the broad horizontal mass of the platform. One rises like a marker, the other spreads like a constructed hill. Together they create contrast, and contrast often helps sacred landscapes speak, even when we no longer know the language. Tall and broad, upright and flat, earth and sky, approach and arrival. Again, we must be careful not to over-translate, but we can notice that the arrangement was not accidental. These were placed things, chosen things, things that took effort. Then there are the offering slabs, which bring the human body back into the picture. A massive platform can feel remote, almost geological. A slab near a ramp feels more immediate. It is a surface for placing something. Food, liquid, animal remains, objects, symbolic gifts, perhaps acts we would not easily recognize. Sardinia Cultura describes one irregularly shaped table near the right side of the ramp as a trachite offering table, and another trapezoidal limestone slab near the ramp, resting on 3 stone bases and marked with 7 holes at the edges, as perhaps a table for bloody sacrifices. The word perhaps is doing important work there. It keeps the door open without pretending we can see every ritual clearly. Archaeology can identify holes, where, placement, materials and associations. It cannot always tell us whether a particular morning was solemn, frightening, festive, ordinary, or all of those at once. Animal sacrifice has often been discussed in relation to the site, and remains of sheep, cattle and pigs have been associated with its ritual use. But again, we should not picture the ancient community as one simple thing. Ritual activity can include feasting, exchange, seasonal gathering, mourning, fertility rites, initiation, ancestor honour, and community politics, sometimes all at the same time. A ceremony can be religious and social and economic without separating neatly into modern categories. If people gathered at Monte they may have brought animals not only as offerings but as food. They may have eaten together. They may have reinforced alliances, settled disputes, arranged marriages, traded goods, remembered the dead, honoured powers of land and sky, or simply participated because this was what their people did at certain times. Ancient sacred places often hold many functions at once. They are not always quiet either. We imagine ruins in silence because ruins are silent now. But in use, Monte may have been full of voices, animals, smoke, tools, footsteps, and the practical business of making ceremony happen without someone dropping the important vessel halfway up the ramp. The village around the altar matters because it prevents us from imagining the monument as completely separate from daily life. The official site states that during the full Copper Age, the sanctuary was surrounded by a village with rectilinear huts and gabled roofs, while the surrounding territory contained domus de Janus necropolises, dolmens, menhirs, and other funerary monuments. This suggests a landscape where living, worship, death, and memory were closely connected. People did not divide the world exactly as we do. Sacred and practical spaces could overlap. A hut near a monument was not necessarily just a house, and a ritual place was not necessarily empty between ceremonies. A prehistoric sanctuary may have been a living centre, a meeting place, a seasonal gathering point, and a visible sign that different communities belong to a shared world. One particularly interesting structure near the monument has been called the Sorcerer's Hut, a name that sounds as if it escaped from a fairy tale and wandered into an excavation report wearing sensible boots. Sardinia Cultura explains that this trapezoidal hut, near the northeast corner of the terrace, had 5 irregular rooms under a single sloping roof and owes its name to finds including the tip of a bovine horn and bivalve shells inside a jug. The name should not be taken too literally. Archaeologists, like everyone else, sometimes inherit dramatic labels from earlier interpretations, but the find is still evocative. Horns, shells, unusual deposits, irregular rooms. These are the kinds of details that make a place feel busy with meanings we cannot fully recover. It may not have belonged to a sorcerer in any storybook sense, but it reminds us that the people around Monte used objects symbolically, arranged spaces carefully, and probably had specialist customs and ritual knowledge that mattered to the community. To understand why the platform feels so strange, it helps to compare it to what many people expect from ancient Sardinia. The island is famous for the nuraghi, those stone towers built later in the Bronze Age. There are thousands of them across Sardinia, and they are so visually dominant that they can make everything before them seem like a preface. But Monte is earlier. It belongs to a pre-nuragic landscape before those towers rose across the island. The official site notes that the monument was likely abandoned during the early Bronze Age, before the development of the nuragic civilization. So this is not a strange variation on a nuraga. It is something older and different, part of a world whose monumental instincts were not yet focused on tower building. If the nuraghi are Sardinia's great stone punctuation marks, Monte is an earlier sentence written in a different grammar. The site also complicates another common expectation, that prehistoric Europe's great monuments were mostly about tombs or standing stones. Of course, Europe has many kinds of prehistoric sites, and any broad statement about them will immediately be attacked by 1,000 exceptions, as it should be. But Monte still stands apart because it is not primarily a tomb, and not simply a megalithic alignment. It is a raised terrace altar, a monumental built platform with a ramp. That form feels closer to traditions we associate with other parts of the ancient world. This is why visitors and writers so often mention Mesopotamian ziggurats. Yet before we cross the sea in our imagination, we need to let the Sardinian structure be itself. It is not a copy sitting awkwardly in the wrong place. It is a local monument made within local history, using local material, surrounded by local village life and burial landscapes. Its oddness is real, but so is its belonging. There's also a small but useful correction to make in how we picture ancient sites. When we visit a restored or excavated monument today, we're not seeing it exactly as its builders saw it. Monte has been excavated, studied, exposed, and partly reconstructed. Its present appearance carries both ancient construction and modern archaeological decisions. That does not make it false. It simply means we are looking at a site that has had more than one life. First, it was a sacred landscape. Then it became an abandoned mound. Then it became farmland and a local feature. Then it became an archaeological puzzle. Then a public heritage site. Each stage changed how people saw it. The ancient builders might not recognize every detail of the modern presentation, but they would probably recognize the essential gesture, the ramp, the raised terrace, the deliberate height, and perhaps they would be amused by our confusion. We stand before it with cameras, guidebooks, scholarly debates, and carefully qualified sentences. They stood before it with knowledge inherited from parents, elders, ritual specialists, and community practice. To them, the platform may not have been mysterious at all. It may have been obvious. Of course, this is where the ceremony happens. Of course, the stone stands there. Of course, the red sanctuary remains within the new one. Of course, the ramp faces that way. Modern archaeology often begins where ancient common sense has disappeared. We ask what they already knew, and because no one can answer us directly, we become very serious about pottery fragments, post holes, and the precise angle of walls. This is not a criticism. Pottery fragments have carried more historical truth than many kings' speeches, but it is a reminder that mystery is sometimes what ordinary meaning becomes after enough time has passed. Still, the physical monument keeps giving us something firm to hold. It tells us there was organization. It tells us there was repeated use. It tells us sacred space and community life were intertwined. It tells us that people in prehistoric Sardinia were capable of large planned construction, long before the better-known tower-building societies of the island. It tells us that the Western Mediterranean was not a quiet backwater, waiting for history to begin elsewhere. It had its own experiments, its own monuments, its own ritual centres, its own ways of turning earth and stone into memory. The name Monte may itself preserve a simpler impression. Tourism Sassari notes that the name probably comes from the Sardinian Logudorese dialect and means something like a mountain or hill of stones, referring to how it appeared before excavation. That is wonderfully practical. Before it was a prehistoric sanctuary, before it was compared to ziggurats, before it entered archaeological debate, it was a hill of stones, a mound in the countryside, a feature in the land. Sometimes names keep the first human reaction alive better than scholarship does. What is that? A mountain of stones. Fair enough. And hidden inside that mountain of stones was a layered monument, an older red sanctuary, a ramp, offerings, huts, standing stones, and the remains of a world that had been waiting beneath an ordinary-looking rise. The more you stay with the site, the less it feels like a single object, and the more it feels like a conversation between levels. Ground level, where people gathered. Ramp level, where movement began. Terrace level, where ceremonies may have taken place. Buried level, where the older red temple remained inside the newer structure. Surrounding level, where huts, stones and tombs connected the monument to a broader landscape. Time itself is layered there. The earlier village, the first sanctuary, the great platform, the later occupation, the abandonment, the rediscovery. Monte da Codi is not only raised in space, it is raised through time, with each phase resting on another. That may be why the structure has such a strong hold on the imagination. It gives us enough to see, but not enough to close the case. You can describe its measurements. You can identify its materials. You can name the cultural phases associated with it. You can trace the ramp and point to the men here, and after all of that, the central feeling remains. Why this form? Why here? Why this raised altar in Sardinia, in a world where other communities were building different kinds of monuments? The platform does not answer in words. It simply stands there, broad and patient, as if the act of rising from the earth was already an answer. And now that the structure itself is in view, the comparison that has followed it for decades begins to press closer. Because once you have seen the ramp, the terrace, and the blunt pyramid-like form, it becomes difficult not to think of other raised sacred platforms, especially those from the ancient Near East. The resemblance can be overstated, and later we will need to treat it carefully, but it cannot be ignored either. Monte da Codi looks westward into Sardinian prehistory, and eastward into a much wider human habit of building upward. It stands in Europe, absolutely, but its shape seems to glance across the Mediterranean, toward older ideas of temples, platforms, and sacred height, and that is where the mystery becomes even more interesting. Once the eye catches that eastern echo, it becomes difficult to unsee it. Monte da Codi is in Sardinia, firmly and physically, under the same Mediterranean light as cork trees, limestone, dry fields, and the Long Island memory of people who lived there before written history. And yet, when you look at the monument from the base of the ramp, something in the shape seems to lean away from the usual picture of prehistoric Europe. The long approach, the raised terrace, the flat summit, the heavy artificial height. It does not whisper of a tomb hidden inside the earth. It does not look like a simple gathering of stones. It seems to belong to that older human habit of making a high place when nature has not provided one conveniently enough. A hill made by hand, a platform for ceremony, a place where the ground itself has been persuaded to rise. This is why people so often compare Monte da Codi to a Mesopotamian ziggurat. The comparison comes naturally, almost too naturally. A ziggurat in its classic Mesopotamian form was not a pyramid tomb like the Egyptian examples most of us know from school pictures, but a staged or terraced tower, a massive solid structure rising level above level, with stairways or ramps leading upward and a shrine at the summit. The Penn Museum's account of the Ziggurat of Ur describes these ancient Mesopotamian monuments as great solid staged towers, smaller at each level, creating the effect of a stepped platform, with stairways or sloping ramps rising from ground level toward a shrine dedicated to a city's patron god. That description is enough to make the imagination glance back at Sardinia with interest. Monte da Codi has a massive built body. It has a ramp. It has a summit platform. It appears to raise ritual above ordinary ground. The resemblance is not imaginary. The danger lies in deciding too quickly what that resemblance means. Because the moment we say ziggurat, a very large door opens. Behind it are the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, with mud brick temples, river plains, priests, scribes, storerooms, gods, grain, and the enormous administrative machinery of early urban life. The Ziggurat of Ur, one of the most famous examples, was built around 2100 BCE by Ur-Nammu of the third dynasty of Ur for the moon god Nanna, according to Smart History's summary of the monument. That world is spectacular, but it is not the same world as 4th millennium and 3rd millennium Sardinia. It belongs to cities, writing, kingship, and temple institutions. Monte da Codi belongs to an island society before the Nuragic towers, before Sardinia's later Bronze Age identity, before texts that could explain its ceremonies for us. To bring Mesopotamia into the conversation is useful, but only if we remember that resemblance is not the same as identity. A house cat and a lion both have whiskers. One of them still should not be invited to sleep on your pillow. The older phases of Monte make the comparison even more interesting, because the Sardinian monument is extremely ancient. The main structure is officially described by Italy's Regional Museum Authority as a rectangular altar, 37 by 30 metres, with a remaining height of about 10 metres and a 42-metre ramp, built at the beginning of the Copper Age between roughly 3500 and 2900 BCE. Recent research has refined the picture further, arguing that most of the radiocarbon dates for the site belong to the 4th millennium BCE, and that the two main building phases can be placed largely within that millennium. This matters because many of the famous Mesopotamian ziggurats people picture are later than the earliest phases of Monte So if we're imagining a simple story in which someone saw a finished ziggurat in Mesopotamia, sailed west, reached Sardinia, and said, "Let's build one of those but with more limestone," the dates and evidence do not let us relax into that easy tale. That is not to say the ancient Mediterranean was sealed into separate rooms. It was not. The sea connected people as well as divided them. Obsidian moved. Pottery styles moved. Ideas about burial, fertility, status, exchange, and ritual could travel in ways that leave uneven traces. A shell found far from the coast, a stone tool made from volcanic glass that came from another island, a shape of pottery that appears in more than one region. Prehistoric people were not frozen in villages staring at the horizon with no curiosity until history politely began. They moved, traded, married, argued, copied, adapted, and probably complained about the weather in several prehistoric dialects. Sardinia was part of a Western Mediterranean network, and the research on Monte specifically notes that Western Mediterranean relationships are well documented through the circulation of Sardinian obsidian and the spread of megalithic monuments. But the same research also states that the old hypothesis of Oriental origins, inspired by the ziggurat model, has no scientific confirmation, and that there is no proven evidence of 4th millennium relationships between Sardinia and the Near East in the form of genetic data, foreign finds, or raw materials. In other words, there were connections, certainly. But the direct Mesopotamian connection remains unproven. That little word unproven is important. It does not mean impossible. It means we do not have the evidence needed to say it responsibly. Archaeology lives in the space between possibility and proof, and it has to be rather disciplined there, even when a good mystery is waving at it from the ramp. A monument can remind us of another monument without being descended from it. Human beings, after all, are very good at inventing similar solutions to similar problems. If you want a sacred place to be visible, you raise it. If you want a ceremony to feel different from ordinary life, you change the level of the ground. If you want movement to be controlled, you create a path. If you want the summit to matter, you build an approach that makes people feel the process of arriving. These are not Mesopotamian instincts alone, they are human instincts. And yet, there is still something powerful about the ziggurat comparison, because it helps us understand what kind of monument Monte is not. It is probably not a tomb in the normal sense. Excavations have not revealed the kind of internal burial chamber one might expect if the mound were built primarily as a grave, and discussions of the site often point out that no tomb was found within the monument. A review of the debates notes that it was once wondered whether the structure was a tomb, but after excavation no tomb had been found. This matters because prehistoric Europe is full of monuments connected to burial and ancestors. Mounds, dolmens, passage graves, rock-cut tombs. Monte sits near burial landscapes, and the surrounding territory includes Domus de Janus and other funerary places, but the platform itself appears to have had a different primary role. It was built not to hide a body, but to lift an action. That distinction brings us closer to the Mesopotamian echo. Ziggurats were not tombs either. They were platforms for temples, visible sacred structures connected to gods, offerings, authority, and the organization of city life. Monte was not a Mesopotamian city temple, but it shares the basic architectural idea of raising a ritual place above common ground. The form says, whether in Ur or Sardinia, that sacred activity benefits from elevation. It becomes visible, it becomes separate, it creates a point where the community can gather its attention. You do not need written tablets to understand the psychological effect of height. Stand at the bottom of any raised sacred place, and your body understands before your mind begins its analysis. Up there is different. It is tempting to imagine the builders standing on the flat Sardinian plain, looking at the sky and deciding that the gods, ancestors, or powers of the world required a handmade hill. That may be too simple, but it catches something true about the architecture. In Mesopotamia, one old explanation for ziggurats was that people from hill country, settling on flat alluvial plains, created artificial mountains for worship. The Penn Museum's historical report presents that interpretation, describing ziggurats as built high places that allowed worship to happen above the level plain. Whether or not that fully explains Mesopotamian ziggurats, the image is useful. A built mountain is not only a structure, it is a statement. It says that the place of contact with the sacred does not have to be found in nature. It can be made by human effort. Monte may have done something similar in Sardinia, though in a local language of stone, earth, ochre, and village ritual. The earlier sacred phase, the so-called Red Temple, had its own ramp and summit structure. Then later, the larger monument incorporated it, covering the older sanctuary in a new, greater platform. That is not only architecture, it is memory management, if one may use a very unromantic phrase for something very ancient. The old sacred place was not removed, it was absorbed. The new monument did not replace the past, it carried the past inside it. This is one of the biggest differences between building and merely piling material. A pile is just accumulation. A monument is accumulation with intention. And if we compare that to Mesopotamia, we find another broad similarity, not necessarily of direct contact, but of sacred rebuilding. In many ancient traditions, sacred sites were rebuilt again and again, not always because people wanted something entirely new, but because the place itself had authority. A new layer made the old place more powerful, not less. Temples could rise on temples. Sanctuaries could be renewed. The past could be preserved by being covered. To us, covering an older temple sounds almost rude. To an ancient builder, it might have been an act of continuity. The sacred center remains here. It is still here. It becomes larger because the relationship continues. The material difference, however, is just as important as the formal resemblance. Mesopotamian ziggurats were typically mud brick and baked brick structures, adapted to river plains where stone was not always available in convenient abundance. Monte is made with limestone blocks, earth and stone fill. Its construction belongs to Sardinian materials and local techniques. The 2023 chronological study specifically warns that, apart from the ramp, Monte has different architectural characteristics and building methods from the ziggurat model. That is the kind of sentence that gently removes the dramatic costume from a theory. The monument may look eastward in shape, but its body is local. It is not wearing Mesopotamian bricks, it is made from Sardinian ground. This is where the mystery becomes more interesting than a simple yes or no. Was Monte a ziggurat? If by ziggurat we mean a Mesopotamian temple tower belonging to the world of Sumerian or later Near Eastern cities, then no, not in the strict sense. Was it ziggurat-like? Yes, in a broad architectural way. Was it inspired by Mesopotamia? Perhaps not directly, and there is no firm evidence to prove such inspiration. Did its builders share with other ancient peoples the idea that sacred power could be expressed through artificial height? Almost certainly. The answer, as often happens in prehistory, is less like a locked box and more like a basket of carefully separated possibilities, some sturdier than others, all requiring gentle handling. There is also a problem with how modern people use comparisons. We often compare the unfamiliar to the famous. When someone sees Monte and calls it the Sardinian ziggurat, The phrase works because ziggurat is more widely recognised than pre-neuralgic terraced altar of northern Sardinia, which does not exactly roll off the tongue at bedtime, but the nickname can quietly shrink the Sardinian monument. It makes Monte de Codi seem important because it resembles something elsewhere, rather than important because it is itself. That is unfair to the builders. They were not producing a footnote to Mesopotamia. They were shaping a sacred landscape in Sardinia according to their own needs, symbols and community life. Still, the comparison can open rather than close the sight if used carefully. Mesopotamia gives us a language for thinking about raised sacred platforms. Sardinia gives us a different case, with different materials, chronology and social background. Put side by side, they show that human beings in separate places can discover the same basic architectural truth. A platform changes everything. It changes the view. It changes the body. It makes gathering visible. It creates a top and a bottom, an approach and an arrival, a place for a few and a place for many. Even if we remove every direct connection, the resemblance still matters because it points to a shared human grammar of sacred height. Imagine standing at Monte de Codi during a gathering in the Copper Age. The ramp is before you. The menhir stands nearby. The offering stones are set around the area. Huts and activities spread beyond. Perhaps animals are being led forward. Perhaps vessels are being carried. Perhaps people have come from nearby settlements, bringing food, goods, and news. The platform rises not like a mountain, but enough to change the scene. Anyone on the top would be seen. Anything placed there would be separated from ordinary ground. Smoke, if there was smoke, would lift into the open sky. Voices, if formal words were spoken, would carry differently. The structure would not need to be enormous by modern standards to transform the gathering. Architecture is not only about size, it is about where it places attention. Now shift the imagination eastward, to the cities of Mesopotamia. There, a ziggurat dominated a built environment of streets, courtyards, temples and administrative spaces. It was part of a city's religious and political identity. It rose above a world of scribes, labour, offerings and stored grain. The ziggurat of was described by Smart History as likely the highest point in the city, visible for miles and serving as a focal point for travellers and worshippers. That is a very different social setting from Monte de Codi, but the visual logic overlaps. Height gathers meaning. Height signals importance. Height says, look here. Perhaps that is why the resemblance has survived in popular imagination, even when scholars urge caution. The eye notices structure before the mind checks evidence. A raised platform with a ramp feels like a clue. It suggests that people were thinking in levels. Earth below, sacred space above, human movement between them. In Mesopotamia, that idea became part of urban temple architecture. In Sardinia, it appeared in this unique prehistoric sanctuary, folded into the island's own cultural development. The similarity may not be a bridge of direct influence. It may be a mirror showing how different societies solve the same ritual problem in stone and earth. The word looks is doing useful work here. Monte de Codi looks toward Mesopotamia. It does not necessarily come from Mesopotamia. It does not need to have been designed by someone who crossed the sea from the east. It looks toward that world because our modern eyes recognise a family resemblance. And because the ancient Mediterranean was not a simple map of isolated cultures, the question of influence cannot be dismissed carelessly either. The right attitude is neither wild certainty nor dull refusal. It is careful curiosity. We let the monument resemble what it resembles. We also let it remain Sardinian. There is another layer to this. The ziggurat comparison often makes Monte de Codi seem out of place in Europe, but maybe that feeling says more about Europe than about the monument. Prehistoric Europe was not one thing. It included farmers, herders, miners, seafarers, megalith builders, mound builders, rock-cut tomb makers, metal workers, and communities with ritual systems we barely understand. It was not waiting passively for civilization to arrive from the east. with a clipboard and a stamped certificate. Western Mediterranean societies were already inventive, connected, and capable of large communal projects. Monte is not an error in the European record. It is a reminder that the record is stranger and more varied than our simplified mental museum allows. The site also forces us to think about how architecture travels without always travelling physically. Sometimes a specific plan moves from one region to another. Sometimes builders migrate. Sometimes objects carry images. Sometimes stories travel farther than people. But sometimes similar buildings appear because the human body and the environment create similar needs. A ramp is a practical solution to elevation. A terrace is a practical solution to gathering on top. A raised platform is a practical and symbolic solution to the desire for separation. There are only so many ways to make Earth higher in a controlled way. If two distant societies both want a ritual high place, they may both arrive at something ramped and terraced without one copying the other. The world is full of convergent solutions. Birds, bats, and insects all learned flight separately. Ancient builders may have learned sacred height separately too, though with fewer wings and much more heavy lifting. And heavy lifting should not be forgotten. Theories can float very easily. Stones do not. Whether influenced by distant ideas or born from local tradition, Monte required labour. People had to organise work. They had to gather material. They had to build retaining walls, fill the core, shape the ramp, maintain the structure, and return to it over generations. That effort tells us that the monument was not casual. It was socially important. A raised altar of this scale does not happen because someone had a free afternoon and an unusual enthusiasm for terraces. It required coordination, authority, belief, obligation, or some mixture of all four. This is where the Mesopotamian comparison fades a little and the Sardinian community comes into focus. The real question becomes not who gave them the idea, but what kind of society could make this idea happen. That question leads us away from the monument as an isolated mystery and toward the people around it. The Ozieri cultural world, the later Abelzo Filigosa horizon, the villages, the tombs, the movement of materials, the rituals of death and fertility, the social changes of the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. Monte did not rise from an empty landscape. It rose from a community already capable of symbolic thought, technical skill, and shared action. It belonged to people who carved tombs like houses for the dead, shaped pottery, used obsidian, raised stones, and made places where memory and ceremony could gather. To understand why this platform was built, we have to meet that older Sardinia more closely. For now, the eastern echo remains beside us, useful but not controlling. Monte can remind us of Mesopotamia without becoming Mesopotamian. It can look like a ziggurat without being one in the strict historical sense. It can be unique in the Western Mediterranean and still part of a larger human pattern. That is the quiet pleasure of the site. It refuses the easiest answer, but rewards the slower one. It asks us to hold two ideas together. This monument feels strangely out of place, and yet it belongs exactly where it is. It belongs to Sardinia's deep prehistory, to an island before the Nuraghi, to communities whose names are gone but whose decisions still rise from the plain in stone, earth and ramped ascent. And to follow that belonging, we need to step away from the comparison for a while and look more closely at the people who lived before Sardinia's famous towers, before the island became the land of Nuraghi, when the older sacred world of Monte was still alive. Before the Nuraghi rose across Sardinia, before those great stone towers became the island's most famous prehistoric signature, there was another Sardinia. It was older, quieter in the archaeological record, and in some ways harder to picture because it did not leave behind thousands of towering silhouettes on hilltops. It left caves, pottery, tombs, villages, carved stones, traces of food, fragments of tools, and places like Monte where the ground itself was shaped into a sacred platform. This was the pre-Nuragic world. and it is easy to treat it merely as the time before something more famous happened. But that would be a mistake. The people who lived in Sardinia before the Nuraghi were not simply waiting around for the Bronze Age to get started. They were farming, herding, trading, burying their dead, decorating their objects, marking their landscapes, and building ceremonial places with enough confidence to leave us puzzled thousands of years later. The term pre-Nuragic is useful, but it is also a little unfair. It defines many centuries of human life by what had not yet appeared. Imagine describing your entire childhood as the pre-mortgage period. Accurate, perhaps, but not exactly generous. In Sardinia, the pre-Nuragic period includes a long sequence of communities and cultural phases stretching across the Neolithic and Copper Age before the rise of the Nuragic civilization in the Bronze Age. Monte belongs to this older world, especially to the later Neolithic and Copper Age phases, often connected with the Ozieri, Sub-Ozieri, and Abelzo-Filigosa cultural horizons. Archaeologists use these names not because they refer to kingdoms or nations in the modern sense, but because they describe patterns in material culture, especially pottery, burial customs, settlement forms, and other traces people left behind. The official cultural summary for Monte places the first altar in an evolved phase of the Ozieri culture, in a settlement with quadrangular huts, above older village remains that may date back to the San Ciriaco culture. That detail is worth lingering on, because it reminds us that Monte did not appear suddenly in an empty plain. There was already life there. Earlier huts, then a village, then the first altar, then the later enlargement. The monument grew out of a place where people had already settled, worked, gathered, and perhaps remembered. Archaeology often gives us these layers in a very dry way. Phase 1, Phase 2, cultural horizon, stratigraphic sequence. But beneath those terms are generations. Grandparents who remembered old houses, children growing up near stones that had already become important, people who knew where paths crossed, where animals grazed, where clay could be found, where the dead were placed, and where the community returned for ceremonies. A sacred monument often becomes sacred not only because of what is built there, but because people keep coming back. The Ozieri culture, also known as the San Michele culture, is often described as one of the major cultural expressions of late Neolithic Sardinia. It is especially known for finely made pottery, decorated with incised and painted geometric patterns, and for a wide spread of settlements and burial places across the island. The name comes from the cave of San Michele near Ozieri, where important finds were discovered. In broad terms, Ozieri communities were farmers and herders, but that simple phrase hides a great deal. Farming means managing soil, seasons, seeds, storage, water, and labour. Water. Herding means watching animal life closely, knowing births, deaths, movement, disease, and the moods of creatures who do not always share humanity's enthusiasm for organisation. These were not primitive people in the lazy sense that word is sometimes used. They lived with technical knowledge, inherited skill, and a very close relationship with the land. They knew how to make a life in Sardinia's varied terrain, from plains and coastlands to hills and caves. Their world was not isolated either. Sardinia was an island, but an island in the Mediterranean is not the same as a closed room. The sea can be a boundary, but it can also be a road. Sardinia was rich in obsidian, a volcanic glass that can be worked into extremely sharp tools. Obsidian from Sardinian sources, especially Monte travelled through Western Mediterranean exchange networks long before written history. This matters because it shows that prehistoric Sardinians were part of broader movements of material and contact. They were not cut off from the world, staring at the waves and wondering what those large wet things were. They knew the sea. They used it, directly or indirectly, as part of a network in which objects, styles, and perhaps ideas could move. That does not mean every unusual building on the island came from abroad, but it does mean Sardinia was part of a connected prehistoric Mediterranean. The people of this older Sardinia also made remarkable places for the dead. One of the most distinctive pre-Nuragic traditions is the Domus de Janas, the rock-cut tombs whose name in Sardinian means houses of the farers or houses of the witches, depending on local tradition and translation. The name is much later, of course, and says more about folklore than about the original builders, but it is wonderfully fitting in atmosphere. These tombs were often carved into rock as if they were houses for the dead, sometimes with doorways, rooms, pillars, hearth-like features, false architectural details and symbolic decoration. The dead were not merely hidden away, they were placed in constructed spaces that imitated or transformed the world of the living. This suggests a deep concern with ancestry, memory and continuity between the household and the afterlife. When we think about Monte da Codi, this matters because the monument stood within a wider landscape that included funerary places, standing stones and ritual features. The living community, the dead, and the sacred ground were not separate subjects. They were part of the same world. In some of these tombs and ritual contexts, archaeologists have found symbols often interpreted as connected to fertility, regeneration, or powerful female imagery. Small figurines, sometimes called mother goddess figures, are part of the wider Neolithic Mediterranean vocabulary, though modern interpretations can easily become too confident. A figurine of a female body might relate to fertility, ancestry, identity, protection, ritual performance, or something else we have not guessed correctly. Ancient symbols do not come with customer service labels. Still, the repeated attention to bodies, death, earth, and regeneration suggests that these communities lived inside a symbolic world where life and death were closely linked. Seeds go into the earth and return as crops. Bodies go into the earth and become ancestors. Animals breed, seasons turn, children are born, and the community continues. In a farming world, this rhythm is not an abstract idea. It is survival. This is the human background against which Monte da Codi makes more sense. A raised altar, a red sanctuary, a ramp offering stones, a menhir, and nearby settlement remains are not random features. They belong to people already skilled at making symbolic landscapes. The same communities who carved houses for the dead into rock could understand why a built height might matter. The same people who placed objects with bodies could understand offerings. The same society that decorated pottery and shaped ritual spaces could build a platform that carried meaning beyond its practical form. Monte da Codi seems strange because it is architecturally unique, but it is not culturally impossible. It grew out of a world where stone, earth, ancestors, animals, colour and ceremony already had serious roles to play. It also helps to remember that archaeological cultures are not people with membership cards. When we say Ozieri culture, we are not describing a single tribe with one language, one political system, one flag, and a surprisingly early committee for pottery standards. We are talking about patterns recognised across material remains. Real life was messier. Neighbouring groups may have differed in speech, family structure, ritual practice, and local custom. They may have met seasonally, exchanged marriage partners, competed over land, shared ceremonies, borrowed styles, and argued about whose goats had wandered into whose field. The archaeological label gives us a useful frame, but it should not flatten the people inside it. Monte da Codi may have served one community or several, or a network of groups who recognised the site as important. It may have been a local sanctuary with wider significance. The truth is probably more social and textured than any single label can hold. By the time the Great Platform phase of Monte da Codi took shape, Sardinia was moving through a period of change. Copper began to appear, though stone tools continued to be used. Social life may have been becoming more complex. Burial customs changed in some regions. Standing stones and statue menhirs appeared in parts of the island, especially in later Copper Age contexts. The Abelzu Filigosa horizon, connected with the later use or restoration of Monte da Codi, is often associated with ancestor worship and statue menhirs in Sardinian prehistory. A general summary of pre-Nuragic Sardinia describes the Abelzu Filigosa culture as developing after Ozieri and notes the erection of statue menhirs, as well as the restoration or construction activity at the great megalithic temple of Monte de Codi. Again, we should treat broad summaries carefully, but the pattern is important. The world around Monte de Codi was not static. It changed over centuries, and the monument changed with it. Change can be hard to see when we look at ancient stones because stone gives the illusion of stillness. But the societies around Monte de Codi lived through generations of adjustment. New materials appeared, contacts shifted, ritual customs evolved. Villages were occupied, abandoned, reused. Tombs were opened and closed. A place that began with one meaning could acquire another. This is one reason the monument is so difficult to interpret. We're not looking at a single ceremony frozen in time. We're looking at a sacred place used across a long span, with different phases of construction and probably different phases of meaning. The people who built the first red-plastered sanctuary may not have thought exactly like the people who enlarged it into the great terrace altar. Later communities who left bell beaker materials at the site may have understood it in still another way. The stones stayed in place, but the human world around them kept moving. Picture the daily life around the sanctuary, not as a vague prehistoric haze, but as ordinary human activity. Huts with walls and roofs, smoke from hearths, pottery drying or being fired, grain being processed, animals being watched, milked, slaughtered, or protected. Children imitating adults with small tools and probably getting in the way, as children have done with great consistency across all historical periods. People mending baskets, shaping stone, carrying water, preparing food, telling stories, noticing weather, making plans and remembering obligations. A monument like Monte de Codi did not float above this life. It drew from it. Every stone carried to the platform came from someone's labour. Every ceremony required preparation. Every offering, if it involved food or animals, came from the economy of the living community. Sacred architecture is never separate from work. It is work directed toward meaning. There may also have been specialists, perhaps not priests in the later institutional sense, with formal titles and robes neatly stored in a sanctuary cupboard, but people who knew the correct actions, the correct moments, the correct substances, the correct stories. In many traditional societies, ritual knowledge is not shared equally by everyone. Certain people remember genealogies, handle burials, speak words, interpret signs, prepare objects, or lead gatherings. At Monte de Codi, someone must have known when ceremonies were held and how they were performed. Someone understood the importance of the ramp, the platform, the stones, the offerings. That knowledge may have been inherited, contested, guarded, or taught. We cannot name those people, but a place like this implies them. Architecture can outlive authority, but it often begins with it. The existence of a monumental sanctuary also raises questions about community organisation. Building Monte de Codi required coordination. Not necessarily a king, not necessarily a rigid hierarchy, but some ability to mobilise people for a shared project. The official description of the site emphasises its long use from the Neolithic to the early Bronze Age, and its combination of altars, huts, sacred stones and burials, which suggests a complex ritual centre rather than a simple isolated construction. Large communal labour can be motivated by belief, by social obligation, by seasonal gathering, by competition between groups, or by the prestige of leaders. In many ancient societies, those things overlap. A leader who organises a feast gains influence. A ritual specialist who controls ceremonies gains authority. A community that builds an impressive monument shows its strength. Sacred work can be political without becoming less sacred. Humans have rarely separated those realms as neatly as we pretend. The people before the Nuragic world were also living through a relationship with the wider Mediterranean that was not yet the world of written trade routes and named kingdoms. Their contacts were older and harder to trace. A pot style here, a material there, a shared form, a borrowed technique, a distant comparison. Earlier, when we look toward Mesopotamia, the danger was imagining a direct line where none has been proven. But when we look at pre-Nuragic Sardinia more broadly, we see that these communities were not sealed off from influence. They lived in a sea-connected world. The important question is not whether influence existed, it almost certainly did in various forms. The question is which influences, from where, how strong, and how they were adapted locally. Monte de' Codi may stand at the edge of that question. It may represent a local tradition that independently produced a raised sanctuary. It may reflect broad Mediterranean ideas about sacred height and ritual platforms. It may preserve memories of contacts we have not yet identified. What we cannot responsibly do is turn uncertainty into certainty just because the story becomes more exciting. The later fame of Nuragic Sardinia can make this earlier world feel overshadowed. The Nuraghi are so numerous and dramatic that they dominate the island's prehistoric image. They rise from hills and plains like stone beehives with military opinions. They're impressive, and they deserve attention. But Monte de' Codi reminds us that Sardinia's monumental imagination was already awake long before them. The people who built the platform did not build Nuraghi, but they did build meaning into the landscape. They did not leave written myths, but they left ritual architecture. They did not explain themselves to us, but they forced us to ask better questions. If the Nuragic world is Sardinia's great Bronze Age voice, then Monte de' Codi belongs to an older register, less loud perhaps, but deeply resonant. It is also worth noting that the transition from pre-Nuragic to Nuragic was not a sudden theatrical scene in which one morning everyone looked at the old rituals and said, "Right, enough platforms, let's do towers." Cultural change is slow, uneven and human. Some traditions continue, others fade. New technologies and social forms emerge alongside old memories. The Monte de' Codi site appears to have been abandoned around the beginning of the Nuragic age, but abandonment does not always mean forgetting. A place can lose its original function and still remain meaningful in stories, place names, movements, or quiet avoidance. The ground remembers even when buildings collapse. Later, people may have seen the mound without knowing its first purpose. They may have reused the area, wondered about it, feared it, respected it, or simply treated it as a strange old rise in the land. The builders themselves are gone beyond recovery as individuals, and this is one of the tender frustrations of prehistory. We can discuss their cultures, tools, pottery and monuments, but not their names. We cannot know who first imagined the red sanctuary, who planned the larger terrace, who carried the first basket of earth, who placed offerings on the stones, who stood at the top of the ramp while others watched below. We cannot know who doubted the project, who took pride in it, who thought the ramp should have been wider, or who, after a long day of construction, sat down and quietly decided that sacred architecture was very heavy. But we can know they were capable of planning, cooperation, symbolic thought, and persistence. We can know they lived in a rich cultural world. We can know that their actions shaped a place strongly enough that thousands of years later, people still travel to see it and ask what it meant, and perhaps that is the most important shift in understanding. Monte de' Codi is not strange because the people before the Nuragic world were simple and somehow produced something inexplicable. It is strange because they were complex in ways we still do not fully understand. Their world does not fit neatly into the categories we inherited from later history. No kings named in inscriptions, no temple accounts, no myths written down by scribes, no map of territories with bright colours and tidy borders. Instead, we have huts, pottery, tombs, pigments, bones, stones, ramps, and a platform that rises from the Sardinian plain. It is a harder kind of evidence, but not a lesser one. So when we stand before Monte de' Codi, we are standing not only before a monument, but before a society's ability to gather itself around an idea. That idea may have involved fertility, ancestors, the sky, the sun, animals, Seasonal cycles, communal identity, or a mixture of meanings that cannot be separated now. It may have changed over time. It may have been understood differently by different people even then. But the raised platform tells us that something needed to be seen, approached, and performed. The surrounding stones and structures tell us that the place was active. The older red temple inside the later monument tells us that memory was built into the construction itself. And the people before the Neuragic world, so often hidden behind the fame of later towers, step forward for a moment through the work of their hands. They were farmers and herders, but not only that. They were builders of tombs that looked like houses, makers of decorated vessels, users of obsidian and early metals, participants in exchange networks, caretakers of ancestors, organisers of labour, and creators of one of the most unusual prehistoric sanctuaries in the Mediterranean. Their world was not ours, and we should not pretend to enter it too easily. But we can approach it slowly, the way the ramp itself approaches the terrace, not in a rush, not with certainty before evidence, but with attention to each level of what remains. And as the people come into better focus, the objects around the platform begin to matter even more. The ramp is no longer just a ramp. The altar is no longer just a mass of stone. The standing stones, offering tables, carved hollows, animal remains, and silent ritual traces become the next clues, waiting around the monument like pieces of a ceremony whose words have been lost but whose setting still holds its shape. A monument can tell you a surprising amount before it tells you anything clearly. Monte does this very well. It lets you see the ramp, the platform, the stones, the open ground, the scattered traces of structures nearby, and then it quietly refuses to explain itself in a complete sentence. That is part of its power. It is not a ruin that gives us a neat story with names, dates, gods, and a closing moral. It is a place built for action, and the actions are gone. What remains is the setting, and settings can be very revealing if we are patient with them. At Monte the ramp does not simply connect the ground to the top. The altar does not simply sit there because people had extra stones. The standing stones, offering slabs, carved hollows, animal bones and unusual objects around the site, all suggest that the monument was part of a ritual landscape, one where movement, placement, sacrifice, memory and community gathering probably mattered deeply. Start with the ramp because the ramp is the most direct instruction the monument still gives. It tells the body where to go. That may sound obvious, but it is not a small thing. A ramp is architecture that controls movement without needing a wall or a command. It says, come this way. It creates a line of approach. It slows people down just enough to make arrival feel intentional. At Monte the ramp is long, around 42 metres in its later phase, leading upward to the broad platform of the altar. The official description of the site identifies the main monument as a terraced altar, in the form of a truncated pyramid, reached by this long ramp, with the earlier sanctuary preserved beneath the later construction. This matters because ritual often begins before anyone reaches the sacred centre. It begins in the approach, in the way bodies are arranged, in the fact that some people may walk ahead while others remain below, in the sense that ordinary ground is being left behind gradually rather than abruptly. If there were processions here, the ramp would have made them visible. People watching from below could see movement rising toward the platform. People walking upward would feel the ground changing beneath them. Objects could be carried. Animals could be led. Vessels, food, liquids, tools, offerings, or symbols could move from the level of daily life toward the level of ceremony. We should be careful not to stage the scene too confidently, because no one left us a schedule saying, "At sunrise, bring 2 sheep, 3 bowls, and please do not block the ramp." But the architecture suggests that movement mattered. A sacred space with a ramp is not only a location, it is a sequence. First you gather, then you approach, then you ascend, then something happens at the top. The top is the part we cannot see well enough. It was the goal of the ascent, the flat raised terrace, the place most likely to have held the central acts of ceremony. Some reconstructions and interpretations suggest that there may have been a structure on top, perhaps a small rectangular sacred building or chapel-like space, especially in the earlier red-plastered phase. Sardinia Cultura describes the old altar as a smaller quadrangular terrace with a ramp, topped by a rectangular cecellum whose floor and parts of the perimeter wall were preserved, and notes the ochre plaster that gave it the name Red Temple. The later monument covered that earlier sanctuary, building a larger platform over it. So even before we talk about offerings, we are looking at a ritual arrangement with depth, an older sacred place sealed inside a newer sacred place, like a memory placed carefully under a larger memory. That is one of the most interesting things about Monte dei Codi. The later builders did not simply flatten the old sanctuary and move on. They built over it in a way that preserved it inside the monument. We cannot know what that meant to them, but it is hard to believe it meant nothing. Ancient communities often treated sacred places as powerful because of continuity. A place mattered because it had mattered before. The old ceremonies, the old stories, the old dead, the old signs in the landscape gave authority to new construction. At Monte dei Codi, the large altar may have grown not just upward but backward, gathering the earlier sanctuary into itself. The result is not a simple monument with one purpose, but a layered place where ritual time was stacked into the earth and stone. Around the ramp and platform were other features that help us imagine the site as a wider ceremonial area. One of the most striking is the menhir, a tall standing stone near the monument. Official and regional descriptions refer to a menhir around 4.5 meters high, along with offering tables, spherical stones with cup marks, huts, and funerary areas connected to the broader sacred landscape. A standing stone near a raised altar changes the way the whole area feels. The platform is broad and heavy. The menhir is vertical and direct. One spreads across the ground, the other points upward. Together they make the space feel marked in more than one dimension. The platform says this is a raised place. The menhir says this is a marked place. It is a little like placing an exclamation point beside a sentence that was already written in stone. What did the menhir represent? That is where certainty begins to thin out. Some interpretations suggest it may have represented a deity, an ancestor, or a symbolic presence. Other standing stones in prehistoric Europe can be connected to memory, territory, death, fertility, or ritual attention depending on context. At Monte dei Codi, the menhir's placement near the ceremonial area suggests that it helped define and sanctify the space. But we cannot simply assign it a name or personality. It may have been a divine marker, a symbolic figure, an ancestral sign, a boundary, or something that does not fit our modern categories. The important thing is that it was set upright deliberately. Someone decided this stone should stand here, and when people make stones stand upright with great effort, they usually expect them to do more than decorate the view. Then there are the offering tables, which bring us closer to the physical actions that may have happened at the site. Descriptions of Monte dei Codi mention large stone slabs near the ramp, interpreted as tables for offerings, libations, or sacrifices. One trapezoidal slab is described as resting on 3 stone supports and marked with 7 holes at the edges, while another irregular stone has also been connected with offering practices. These features are much more intimate than the platform itself. A platform can seem monumental and distant, but an offering table is a surface at human scale. It is where hands place things. It is where liquid might be poured, where food might be set down, where blood, grain, milk, water, oil, or other substances could become part of an act that mattered because it was done correctly and in the right place. Of course, the exact rituals are lost. This is where imagination must stay on a leash, even if it is a very curious leash. We know that offerings were likely made. We know that animal remains have been found in connection with ritual activity. We know that stones with holes, slabs, and marked objects suggest repeated ceremonial practices. But we do not know the words spoken, the timing of the ceremonies, the identity of the powers addressed, or how the participants felt. Were these rites solemn, festive, fearful, seasonal, connected with fertility, death, weather, animals, ancestry, healing or social bonds? Possibly several of these. Rituals are rarely only one thing. A meal can be religious, political, social, emotional and practical all at once. Anyone who has attended a family holiday dinner will understand the principle. Animal bones are among the strongest clues that the site involved ritual meals or sacrifices. Cultural summaries describe the remains of animal bones linked to ritual meals, offerings, or sacrifices, including animals such as sheep, cattle, and pigs in some archaeological interpretations. But the phrase animal sacrifice can mislead us if we hear it only in a dramatic way. Sacrifice in ancient contexts was often not simply destruction. It could involve sharing. Part of an animal might be offered to a deity, ancestor, or sacred force, while another part was eaten by the community. The act could turn ordinary food into social and spiritual connection. A feast at a sanctuary could bind people together, reaffirm belonging, mark a season, honour the dead, or negotiate status. The animal was not just food, and the meal was not just eating. If ceremonies at Monte involved communal meals, the site may have been noisy at times. That is easy to forget because ruins today are usually quiet. We visit them with respectful steps, murmured explanations, and occasionally the distant sound of someone trying to open a snack wrapper, discreetly and failing. But in use, a sacred gathering could have been full of sound. Animals calling, people speaking, tools scraping, fires crackling, vessels being set down, children being told to stay away from something important. Ceremonies do not happen in silence unless silence is specifically part of them. Monte today may feel still, but its ancient life may have been active, social, and filled with the practical work of ritual. The cup-marked spherical stones add another layer of difficulty. Cup marks are small hollows carved or pecked into stone, and they appear in many prehistoric contexts across Europe and beyond. Their meanings vary and are often debated. At Monte spheroidal limestone blocks with cup marks are part of the group of sacred stones around the monument. They may have been used in libations where liquid was poured into or over the hollows. They may have held symbolic meaning connected to fertility, stars counting, offerings, or something entirely local. The truth is that cup marks are excellent at surviving, and rather poor at explaining themselves. A small hollow in stone can hold liquid, pigment, seeds, fat, ash, or meaning. Unfortunately, meaning leaves the least residue. Still, their presence near the altar matters. These stones were not lying around randomly in a forgotten corner. They were part of the sacred arrangement. They helped create a zone where natural material had been modified, marked, and placed. A cup mark takes a stone and gives it repeated points of attention. It makes the surface usable in a different way. If liquid was poured there, then the stone became part of the action. If offerings were placed there, it became a receiving surface. If the marks had symbolic meaning, they made the stone readable to those who knew the code. And if we do not know the code, we can at least see the care. There is also the carved stele with a stylized female figure, sometimes discussed in relation to fertility, or a mother goddess interpretation. Some cultural descriptions mention an altar or stele depicting a thin female figure in relief, and link the overall ritual evidence to possible fertility rites. This is one of those places where archaeology and modern imagination must negotiate carefully. The phrase mother goddess can be useful, but it can also become too broad, as if every prehistoric female image means exactly the same thing from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Human beings have always made images of bodies for many reasons. Some may relate to fertility, yes. Others may relate to ancestry, protection, identity, myth, transformation, or ritual status. At Monte a female figure may suggest ideas of life, regeneration, earth, or sacred femininity. But we should not pretend the image comes with a caption. Even so, fertility is a reasonable theme to consider. Farming and herding communities live very close to cycles of reproduction. Grain must sprout, animals must breed, women give birth, seasons return, rain comes or does not come, which is rude of it. The health of the community depends on bodies, soil, animals and weather cooperating enough to keep people alive. A sanctuary might focus on these concerns because they were not abstract beliefs, they were daily realities. If Monte da Codi was connected to fertility, the idea would not necessarily be narrow or sentimental. Fertility could mean crops, animals, human families, land, social continuity, and the renewal of life after death. A raised altar in such a world might be a place where people tried to maintain the balance between what they could control and what they could only ask for. The presence of nearby burials and funerary landscapes suggests another important theme. The dead were not far away. The broader area around Monte da Codi includes hypogeal tombs and other funerary monuments, connecting the sanctuary to a landscape of death and memory. In pre-Nuragic Sardinia, rock-cut tombs known as Domus de Janus often shape the relationship between the living and the dead. At Monte da Codi, the raised platform and the tomb landscape may have worked together as parts of a larger ritual geography. The living gathered at the altar, the dead rested in the surrounding land. Offerings might have been made not only to gods or forces of nature, but also in relation to ancestors. We do not know exactly, but the closeness of ritual and burial is difficult to ignore. This relationship between life, death and ceremony may be one reason the monument was rebuilt rather than abandoned after the earlier phase. Sacred places often accumulate authority because they hold memory. If ancestors were remembered there, if ceremonies had succeeded there, if important gatherings had happened there, then the place itself became a kind of social anchor. To rebuild it larger was not simply to improve the architecture. It may have been to renew the bond between people and place. The old red sanctuary was covered, but not destroyed in the ordinary sense. It remained inside the new monument, as if the past had been made into the foundation of the present. That is a very old human habit. We do it with buildings, customs, names and stories. We build new lives over older ones and hope the foundation holds. One thing that makes Monte da Codi especially fascinating is that its rituals seem to have required both open visibility and restricted access. The platform was large and visible, the ramp made ascent public, but not everyone may have gone to the top. In many ceremonial settings, some people watch while others perform. Some approach closely while others remain below. Some objects are carried upward by specialists or elders. Some actions are meant to be seen from a distance, while other details are understood only by those allowed near them. We cannot know the social rules at Monte da Codi, but the architecture permits that kind of arrangement. The raised platform creates separation without total concealment. It lets ceremony be both public and elevated. This is important because ritual is often about controlled access. Ordinary life is full of shared activity, but sacred action may require boundaries. Not necessarily walls, though walls can help if one is worried about goats wandering into the holy area. Boundaries can be made by height, by direction, by timing, by who is allowed to carry certain objects, by where people stand, by what is said and when. The ramp at Monte da Codi may have been one of those boundaries. It was a path, but also a filter. It organised the movement from outside to inside, from below to above, from common ground to ceremonial ground. The stones around the site may have helped create another kind of boundary. Menhirs, slabs, cup-marked stones, and other megalithic elements can define a sacred zone without enclosing it completely. They mark the landscape so that people know where ordinary movement changes into ritual movement. Even today, a simple stone marker can alter behaviour. Put a stone at the edge of a path and people walk around it. Place a memorial on a roadside and the same patch of ground becomes charged with memory. Human beings are remarkably responsive to marked places. We do not need a wall if a sign, stone or arrangement tells us that attention is required. There may also have been astronomical or directional meaning in the layout, though this is another area where caution is useful. Some studies have explored possible topographical and astronomical aspects of Monte de' Codi, including the orientation of the monument and its relationship to the surrounding landscape. Ancient people certainly watched the sky. Farmers, herders, and ritual specialists had good reasons to notice the sun, moon, stars, seasons, and horizon points. But proving exact astronomical intention is difficult. Many structures point somewhere, and somewhere is often near something interesting if you look long enough. Still, the possibility that Monte de' Codi related to sky cycles fits the broader pattern of prehistoric ceremonial landscapes. A raised platform under an open sky naturally invites attention to light, shadow, sunrise, sunset, and seasonal change. Imagine the platform in different conditions: morning light spreading across the ramp, midday sun flattening every shadow, evening turning the stones warm and low, rain darkening the earth, wind moving across the plain. A ritual place changes with weather and season, and those changes may have mattered. A ceremony at dawn is not the same as one at noon. A gathering after harvest is not the same as one before planting. A sacrifice in a dry year does not feel like one in a good year. The monument was stable, but the life around it was seasonal. That combination of fixed place and changing time is one of the foundations of ritual. You return to the same place because the world around it keeps changing. The silence of Monte de' Codi today can make all of this feel distant, but the objects are not silent in the sense of being empty. They are silent because their language is incomplete for us. The ramp speaks of approach, the platform speaks of elevation, the offering tables speak of placement, the animal bones speak of killing, eating, or giving. The menhir speaks of marking the sacred zone, the red ochre speaks of colour and deliberate treatment, the cup marks speak of repeated small actions, the nearby tombs speak of memory and the dead. None of these clues gives us the full ritual script, but together they form a pattern too strong to dismiss. What we should avoid is imagining one single ceremony and letting it stand for centuries. Monte de' Codi was used, altered, and remembered over a long span. Rituals may have changed. New groups may have arrived or interacted with older traditions. Meanings may have shifted from fertility to ancestry, from local community gathering to wider ceremonial importance, or from one sacred story to another. The later appearance of bell beaker materials at the site suggests that the monument remained part of a changing cultural landscape after its main construction phases. Archaeology often reveals this kind of long afterlife. A place built for one purpose becomes meaningful to people with different customs, and they leave their own traces. The stones remain, but their audience changes. That may be why Monte de' Codi still resists a single explanation. It was not one ritual frozen forever. It was a ritual place with a biography. It had childhood, maturity, alteration, reuse, and abandonment. The Red Temple was one stage. The Great Altar was another. The surrounding stones and offerings were part of ongoing practice. Later materials show continued contact with changing communities. And after abandonment, the monument became something else again. A mound, a hill of stones, a mystery under farmland, then an archaeological site. Every stage added distance from the original acts, but also preserved the central fact that this place had mattered, and it mattered enough for people to gather at the edge of the ordinary world and do something that needed stone, height, animals, offerings, and memory. That is the strongest conclusion we can safely hold. Whether they were honouring a goddess, ancestors, earth powers, sky powers, fertility, the dead, the seasons, or a combination of all these, the builders and users of Monte de' Codi created a place where human action met something larger than daily routine. They did not leave us their prayers, they left us the architecture of praying, or offering, or feasting, or remembering. The words are gone, but the arrangement remains. So when we look again at the ramp, it no longer seems like a simple access feature. It becomes the line along which the community moved into meaning. The altar is no longer just a raised mass, It is the surface where something was transformed by being placed above the ground. The stones are not decoration. They are markers, receivers, witnesses, perhaps even participants in the old sense that sacred objects can be treated as active presences. The animal bones are not just refuse. They are remains of meals, offerings, deaths, and relationships between humans and the animals that sustained them. The silence is not emptiness. It is the silence that comes after a very long conversation has ended, leaving only the room, the table, and a few things still lying where hands once set them down. And this brings us naturally to the hardest question, the one that waits behind every ramp and altar stone at Monte Codi. We can see that rituals happened here. We can see that the place was planned, marked, rebuilt, and used. We can see clues of offerings, feasting, sacrifice, memory, and perhaps fertility. But why this form? Why build a raised platform at all? Why cover the earlier red sanctuary instead of simply using it as it was? Why make a monument so unusual in the Western Mediterranean that people are still comparing it to distant temple towers thousands of years later? The stones can tell us how the place was shaped, and the finds can tell us what may have happened around it. But the deeper reason, the idea that first pulled earth and stone into this strange high form, is still waiting just beyond the evidence, patient as the platform itself. The deeper reason for Monte Codi is the question that stays behind after everything visible has been described. The ramp can be measured, the platform can be mapped, the stones can be photographed, catalogued, and placed in careful diagrams. The earlier red temple can be dated, at least approximately. The later construction can be studied layer by layer. But the first thought that caused people to gather earth and stone into a raised sacred form is harder to reach. That thought did not fossilize. It did not leave a neat inscription at the base saying, "We built this because." Ancient builders, very inconsiderately for future documentary writers, rarely made their deepest motives easy to recover. So we stand before Monte Codi with good evidence, strong clues, several reasonable theories, and one very old silence sitting patiently among them. The simplest answer is that Monte Codi was built as a sacred place. That may sound almost too broad to be useful, like answering "what is the ocean?" by saying wet. But in this case, broadness is honest. The site includes a monumental altar, an older red-plastered sanctuary beneath it, a ramp, standing stones, offering slabs, nearby huts, and a funerary landscape around it. Sardinia Cultura describes the complex as including an altar, a village, and a hypogeic necropolis, and calls the altar unique on the island and in the Western Mediterranean. It also notes the earlier ochre-plastered red temple beneath the later structure, along with offering tables, a menhir, steles, and surrounding huts. These are not the remains of an ordinary farmyard that became oddly ambitious. They point toward ritual, gathering, memory, and something that the people of the time treated as important enough to build in stone. But sacred place is not the same as a single purpose. A church can be a place for worship, music, burial, community meetings, festivals, private grief, public identity, and someone quietly checking the time because the service is running long. A prehistoric sanctuary may have held even more overlapping meanings, because the categories we separate today, religion, politics, family, food, death, weather, land, and authority, may not have been separate to its builders. Monte Codi may have been built for fertility, for ancestors, for seasonal rites, for offerings to deities, for social gatherings, for territorial identity, for ceremonies tied to the sky, or for several of these at once. The challenge is not that we have no possible answers. The challenge is that the possible answers gather around the monument like people at the foot of its ramp, each one plausible, none of them able to climb alone to the top and declare victory. One theory, perhaps the most common in popular descriptions, is that the site was connected with fertility. This idea is not pulled from thin air. The site has been associated with possible fertility rites because of the ritual setting, the standing stone, sacrificial tables, animal bones linked to ritual meals, and a relief figure interpreted by some as female. The Ede's cultural description says that pre-Nuragic communities may have met there to perform rites linked to fertility, pointing to the menhir, 2 sacrificial tables, animal remains from ritual meals, and an altar depicting a thin female figure in relief. Fertility in this ancient context should not be imagined only in the narrow modern sense. It may have meant the fertility of fields, animals, people, families, and the land itself. For farming and herding communities, fertility was not a soft symbolic extra. It was survival with a ceremonial vocabulary. Think of a community living close to the rhythms of soil and animals. Grain either grows or it does not. Rain comes at the right time or it does not. Flocks reproduce or they decline. Children are born and not all survive. The earth gives food, but only if many things happen correctly, and many of those things are beyond human control. In such a world, ritual is not a decoration placed on top of life. It is one way of negotiating uncertainty. People work the fields, tend the animals, store the food, repair the huts, and then still must face the fact that weather, disease, birth, and death do not always obey effort. A sanctuary may become the place where the community brings those anxieties and hopes into a shared form. You climb the ramp not because stone has magic in itself, perhaps, but because the act of gathering, offering, speaking, and remembering makes the world feel held together. The red temple beneath the later monument strengthens the feeling that the site was concerned with transformation and renewal. Its walls and floor were plastered and painted in red ochre, and ochre appears in many prehistoric contexts, including burials and symbolic settings. We should not overstate its meaning, because red can carry different meanings in different cultures. But it is difficult to ignore the colour. Red can suggest blood, life, heat, birth, death, earth, and return. It can mark a surface as different from ordinary stone. It can make a room feel charged. At Monte the earlier sanctuary was not merely functional, it was treated, it was coloured, it was made visually and symbolically distinct. The later platform then covered it, keeping that red space sealed inside the larger monument like an old pulse beneath new skin. Another theory is that Monte was built as a place for honouring deities, perhaps male and female divine figures. The Regional Museum Authority describes Monte as a meeting place for believers from nearby villages and other Sardinian areas, where rituals were performed to honour male and female gods, including the mother goddess. That does not mean we can reconstruct a neat pantheon, with names, family trees, and a divine office schedule. We are not dealing with written mythology, but the possibility of divine worship fits the setting. A raised altar offering stones, animal remains, and symbolic figures all suggest that rituals may have addressed powers beyond the human community. These powers may have been imagined as gods, ancestors, spirits, earth forces, sky forces, or categories that do not map cleanly onto later religious language. It is tempting to ask, which god was worshipped there? But that may be the wrong kind of question. The people of Monte may not have thought in terms of one god attached to one building, in the way later temple cultures sometimes did. Their sacred world may have been more fluid, tied to land, death, fertility, animals, ancestors, and the cycles of the year. A single site could serve several ritual purposes. One ceremony might focus on the renewal of life, another might involve the dead, another might mark a gathering between communities, another might involve offerings before a seasonal transition. To us, these look like different themes. To the builders, they may have belonged to one continuous understanding of how the world remained balanced. The ancestor theory is just as compelling in its own quiet way. Monte stood within a landscape that included tombs and funerary features. The necropolis near the site, carved into limestone, included decorated hypogeal tombs, and the broader pre-Nuragic world of Sardinia placed enormous care into houses for the dead. If the dead were understood as present, powerful, or necessary to the continuity of the living, then a great raised altar near burial spaces could have helped connect the community to its ancestors. Not necessarily in a gloomy way. Ancestor rituals are not only about mourning, they can be about belonging. They tell a community who it is, where it comes from, and why the land matters. A place like Monte de Codi may have said, "Here we gather not only with the living, but under the memory of those who came before." This helps explain why the monument was built over an earlier sanctuary instead of starting fresh somewhere else. A sacred place can become more powerful precisely because it has history. The first altar may have held the authority of earlier ceremonies. Covering it with a larger monument did not necessarily erase it. It may have preserved and amplified it. Sardinia Cultura states that a fire during the Filigosa phase made it necessary to build a new structure, the one preserved today, over the earlier altar. Even if the immediate cause involved damage or burning, the decision to rebuild in the same place matters. They didn't walk away and choose a new field. They returned to the old centre and made it larger. That is not just repair, it is commitment. Fire itself adds another layer of meaning, though we should be careful here. Archaeologically, fire can be accidental, destructive, ritual, or some mixture of all three. A sanctuary may burn because of an event gone wrong, because roofs and organic materials are vulnerable, because enemies damage it, or because fire is part of a deliberate closing or transformation. We do not know exactly what happened at Monte de Codi, but the result is clear enough. The earlier structure was followed by a new and larger one. In human terms, that is a familiar pattern. Something old is damaged. The community must decide whether to abandon it or rebuild. If they rebuild, the new form carries the wound inside it. The later altar may therefore be not only a monument of ritual, but a monument of renewal after disruption. Another possible reason for building Monte da Codi is social gathering. This is less dramatic than fertility cults or mysterious gods, but perhaps more powerful. The regional museum source calls Monte da Codi a meeting place, used by believers from surrounding villages of the Nura and other Sardinian areas. A sanctuary can bring scattered communities together. People living in different settlements need places where they can meet, exchange goods, arrange marriages, share news, settle disputes, perform ceremonies, and confirm that they belong to a wider network. In a world without cities as we imagine them, without written contracts, without state institutions, recurring gatherings at a sacred centre could do essential social work. The platform may have made community visible to itself. A monument like Monte de Codi is therefore not only a place for gods or ancestors, it may also be a place where human society organises itself. Building it would have required cooperation. Using it would have reinforced cooperation. Returning to it would have reminded people of shared obligations. The platform could have stood as proof that the community, or a network of communities, could act together. It is hard to overstate how important that is. Monumental architecture often does two things at once. It expresses belief, and it creates the social structure needed to express that belief. People build the monument, and then the monument helps build the people into a community. This is where the effort of construction becomes part of the answer. Why build it? Because building itself may have mattered. Carrying stone, preparing earth, arranging blocks, shaping the ramp, plastering surfaces, maintaining the sanctuary and returning for ceremonies all created shared labour. Shared labour creates memory. People remember who helped, who led, who provided animals, who carried material, who prepared food, who knew the rituals. A monument is not only the finished object, it is the process that made it. Long before anyone stood on the platform for a ceremony, the act of building had already gathered people around the site. The sacredness of Monte de Codi may have grown not only from what happened after it was finished, but from the many human acts required to make it rise. There is also the possibility that Monte de Codi was built to mark territory or identity, not in the modern sense of a border post, with a sign politely informing visitors where one administrative district ends and another begins, but as a visible statement in the landscape. A large raised sanctuary says that this place is central. It tells travellers and neighbouring groups that a community has roots here, rituals here, ancestors here, power here. The monument could have been seen from the surrounding area. Its ramp and platform created a focus. The name later associated with it, often understood as a hill or mountain of stones, reminds us that before excavation, it stood as a noticeable feature in the land. Even when its original meaning faded, its presence remained. Perhaps it also related to the sky. The platform lifted people into open air, and some scholars have explored possible astronomical or topographical aspects of the site. This does not mean we should imagine it as an ancient observatory in the modern scientific sense, with someone in a hide cloak saying, "According to my calculations, sunrise will be at 6:13. But prehistoric communities watched the sky carefully. The sun governed day and season. The moon shaped night, tides, light, and timekeeping. Stars could guide movement and mark seasonal change. A raised platform with a planned orientation could have been used in ceremonies tied to sunrise, sunset, solstices, lunar cycles, or seasonal transitions. The evidence is debated, but the possibility fits the broader pattern of human ritual attention to the heavens. Still, the sky may not have been separate from fertility, ancestry, and community. Modern explanations like to divide things into neat categories: astronomical function, religious function, social function. Ancient use may not have done that. A sunrise ceremony could also be a fertility rite. A seasonal gathering could honour the dead. A feast could create alliances. An offering to a goddess could also affirm control over land. A platform oriented toward a horizon point could be both a sacred stage and a calendar marker. If Monte de Codi feels difficult to explain, it may be because our questions are too narrow. We ask for one purpose. The monument may have had a whole bundle of purposes tied together, like a basket full of ritual, food, memory, politics, and weather anxiety. The comparison with Mesopotamian ziggurats has sometimes encouraged another kind of explanation. Perhaps the monument was built as an artificial mountain. This idea is not unreasonable, as long as we do not force it too far. Many cultures treat mountains as sacred because they rise toward the sky, stand apart from ordinary land, and offer a sense of contact between levels of the world. In a relatively open plain, a constructed platform can create that effect. Monte de Codi may have been a handmade high place, a way of turning flat land into a ceremonial height. It did not need to be enormous like later urban temple towers to work symbolically. For the people gathered below, a raised terrace could have been enough. Sacred height is relative. Even a few meters can change how an action feels. This may be one of the most basic reasons it was built, to create separation. Ritual often depends on separating one place from another, one time from another, one kind of action from ordinary action. At Monte de Codi, separation is made through elevation. You're below, then you ascend. You're on common ground, then you reach the terrace. You're among the crowd, then perhaps a smaller group performs above. The structure makes difference visible. It does not hide the sacred in a cave or chamber. It lifts it. That is an architectural choice with enormous meaning. A hidden shrine creates intimacy and secrecy. A raised altar creates display and public attention. Monte de Codi seems to have chosen visibility. The offering tables near the ramp suggest that not everything happened at the summit. Some actions may have taken place below or around the base. This creates a more complex ritual choreography. Perhaps offerings were prepared below and taken upward. Perhaps certain sacrifices happened near the ramp, while other acts took place above. Perhaps the men here marked a presence or boundary. Perhaps the cup-marked stones received libations. The site may have worked as a series of ritual stations rather than a single point. A person moving through it would encounter different stones, surfaces and levels, each with its own role. If so, Monte de Codi was not just an object to look at. It was a place to move through correctly. The female figure on one of the steles adds to the mystery. If it represents a goddess, ancestor, ritual specialist or symbolic body, then the site may have held a strong connection to feminine imagery. But once again, certainty slips away. Modern viewers often call such figures mother goddesses, and sometimes that may be appropriate. But the ancient people may have understood the image in a more specific local way. It could have represented a divine presence, a mythic ancestor, a principle of life, or something tied to burial and rebirth. We must not turn every prehistoric female image into the same universal goddess, because ancient women, goddesses, symbols, and bodies deserve better than being filed under one very large and convenient label. Still, the presence of the figure matters. It tells us the site was not only architectural, it was also symbolic in image and form. Another theory is that Monte dei Coddi served as a place of transformation between life and death. This idea draws together the red ochre, the nearby necropolis, possible fertility symbols, animal sacrifice, and the act of raising offerings above the ground. In many ancient societies, death was not understood as a simple end. It was a transition requiring ritual care. The dead might become ancestors, the body might return to earth, the community might need ceremonies to maintain connection between those who had died and those still living. A raised altar near tombs could serve as a place where that relationship was renewed. Food, animals, liquid or symbolic objects might move between worlds, not literally in a way we can test, but ritually in a way that made sense to the people performing the acts. If this was part of the purpose, then Monte dei Coddi may have been built to organise the relationship between earth below and sky above, between buried dead and living community, between visible action and invisible forces. That may sound abstract, but the architecture is quite practical about it. The dead are in the landscape, the living gather on the ground, the ramp rises, the altar lifts ceremony upward, the stones mark attention. The offerings move from human hands into sacred space. The entire place becomes a machine for relationship, not a mechanical machine, of course, but a social and ritual one. It takes ordinary things, animals, food, stones, colour, movement, and turns them into acts of meaning. There is another possibility that is less often dramatic but deeply human. Perhaps Monte dei Coddi was built because a community needed permanence. In a world of seasonal change, human death, shifting settlements and uncertain harvests, a monument gives stability. It says, this place remains. People are born and die, animals come and go, crops fail and return, but the platform stands. The ramp is still there. The stone remains upright. Returning to such a place can make time feel ordered. It gives memory a location. When a child grows up watching ceremonies there, then returns as an adult, then later brings their own children, the monument becomes part of the community's sense of continuity. It does not merely hold rituals, it holds time. And perhaps this is why the question of purpose cannot be answered with one clean phrase. Monte dei Coddi may have been built because people needed a sacred height, a gathering centre, a place for offerings, a connection to ancestors, a focus for fertility rites, a marker of community identity, and a way to preserve the power of an older sanctuary after destruction or change. These explanations do not cancel each other, they reinforce one another. A good sacred place is rarely useful for only one thing. It becomes important because many strands of life can be tied there. The most honest answer, then, is that Monte dei Coddi was built to make meaning visible. That may sound simple, but it includes a great deal. Meaning became visible in the ramp that guided bodies, in the altar that lifted actions, in the red-plastered sanctuary that marked a special interior world, in the stones that stood upright or received offerings, in the animal remains that hint at sacrifice and shared meals, in the rebuilding that folded an older sacred place into a newer one, in the surrounding village and tombs that made the sanctuary part of everyday life and death. The monument turned belief into landscape. It made ritual heavy enough to last. We may never know the first story told about Monte dei Coddi, We may never know the names of the powers honoured there, the songs sung there, the fears carried there, or the exact reason one person first said in whatever language they spoke that this place should rise. But the absence of that answer does not make the monument empty. It makes it human. Much of human life is built from things we cannot fully explain even while we live them. Why a family keeps returning to the same table, why a grave is visited long after practical need has passed, why certain views make us quiet, why old buildings can feel like they are holding memories for us. The builders of Monte da Codi lived in a different world, but they shared that impulse to give important things a place. So the mystery of why it was built remains, but it is not a blank mystery. It has edges. It has a ramp, a red room, a platform, stones, bones, offerings, tombs, fire, rebuilding, and generations of return. It asks us not to solve it too quickly. It asks us to imagine a Sardinia before the Nuraghi, where communities gathered from the surrounding landscape to make contact with powers they understood better than we do. It asks us to see the island not as remote or simple, but as active, inventive, and connected in ways that are still being traced. Because Monte da Codi was not only a sacred place in one field near Sassari, it belonged to an island set in the middle of sea routes, exchanges, influences, and older Mediterranean movements, and the more closely we look at Sardinia itself, the more this strange platform begins to seem less like an isolated exception, and more like a sign of an island standing between worlds. To understand Monte da Codi properly, it helps to stop thinking of Sardinia as a remote dot in the sea. That is how islands often appear on maps, neat little shapes floating apart from the mainland, as if they were politely minding their own business, while history happened somewhere else. But maps can be misleading in that way. They show land clearly and water as blank space, when for ancient people the sea was not always empty at all. It could be a road, a barrier, a source of food, a danger, a boundary, a connection, and occasionally a very rude place to be during bad weather. Sardinia sat in the middle of the Western Mediterranean, and that position made it both protected and exposed, both independent and connected. It was an island between worlds. This is one of the reasons Monte da Codi feels so difficult to classify. If we imagine prehistoric Europe as a collection of inland farming cultures, then the monument looks like an interruption. If we imagine Sardinia as an isolated island with a single local tradition, developing quietly on its own, then the platform also feels surprising. But if we picture Sardinia as part of a wider Mediterranean zone, where people, goods, materials, ideas and customs moved across water over long periods of time, then Monte da Codi begins to feel less like a historical accident, and more like a sign of a complex island world. Not a copy of somewhere else, not a misplaced temple from the east, but a Sardinian creation shaped in a landscape that was never as cut off as it appears from a distance. Sardinia's geography matters here. It is large, mountainous in places, rich in varied landscapes, and positioned between several important regions. The Italian peninsula to the east, Corsica just to the north, the Balearic direction to the west, North Africa to the south, and the broader Mediterranean world beyond. To ancient communities, that did not mean constant travel in the way modern people think of travel. No one was casually booking a long weekend in the Copper Age with a small bag and a worrying number of sandals, but movement did happen. Boats crossed between coasts and islands. Materials moved farther than the people who first gathered them. A stone tool made from Sardinian obsidian could end up far from its source. A decorative style could be borrowed, changed, and made local. A ritual idea could travel in fragments, not as a complete instruction manual, but as a gesture, a shape, a habit, a story. One of the strongest signs of Sardinia's prehistoric connections is obsidian. This volcanic glass, especially from the Monte Arci region, was highly valued in the Neolithic because it could be worked into sharp blades and tools. Sardinian obsidian travelled through exchange networks across parts of the Western Mediterranean. That fact alone tells us something important. The island was not sealed away. People knew where valuable materials came from. They moved them by sea and through chains of exchange. Even if the person using an obsidian blade somewhere else never met the person who first quarried the stone, the material itself carried Sardinia outward. It made the island part of a larger network long before written records gave names to traders, ships, or ports. This does not mean that Monte da Coddi must have been caused by foreign influence. That would be too simple. But it means we should not be surprised that Sardinian communities were able to absorb, adapt, and develop complex ideas. An island that participates in exchange does not merely receive objects, it receives possibilities. A new vessel shape, a new way of decorating pottery, a new tool, a new animal, a new burial habit, a new story from a visitor, even a rumour of how distant people mark sacred places. These things do not arrive as fully formed copies. They enter local life, where people decide what to keep, what to ignore, and what to transform. Culture does not travel like a parcel delivered to the wrong address. It travels more like a recipe told from memory, altered by each cook, adjusted for available ingredients, and sometimes improved by accident. Sardinia was also shaped by its own strong internal traditions. Before the Nuragic period, its communities had already developed distinctive burial practices, including the rock-cut tombs known as Domus de Janus. They carved the dead into the landscape through chambers that sometimes imitated houses, with doors, rooms, pillars, and symbolic details. That is not the behaviour of a culture waiting for inspiration from outside. It is the behaviour of people with their own powerful ideas about death, dwelling, memory, and the relationship between the living and the dead. They marked stones, made decorated pottery, used red ochre, built villages, raised menhirs, and shaped sacred places. Monte da Coddi belongs to this internal Sardinian world just as much as it belongs to the broader Mediterranean one. This balance is important, because when an ancient monument looks unusual, there is always a temptation to explain it by pointing somewhere else. It must have come from the east. It must have been brought by migrants. It must be evidence of a lost route, a forgotten colony, a hidden civilization, or someone very determined with a boat and a strong opinion about ramps. Sometimes such explanations are right in archaeology. People do move, colonies do happen, technologies and religious ideas do spread, but Monte da Coddi has to be handled more carefully. Its form resembles raised temple platforms in broad ways, but its materials, chronology, construction, and cultural setting are Sardinian. The monument looks outward, but it is rooted inward. That is perhaps the best way to understand Sardinia itself during this long prehistoric period, outward facing and inward rooted. The sea brought contact, but the island transformed contact into local forms. Isolation and connection were not opposites. They worked together. The sea made Sardinia distinct because water separates, but the same sea made exchange possible because water carries boats. This is why islands often develop unusual cultures. They are close enough to receive influences and separate enough to reshape them into something distinctive. A mainland culture may blend gradually across land borders. An island can preserve old traditions while also receiving sudden pulses of contact from across the sea. It can be conservative and experimental at the same time, which sounds contradictory until one remembers human beings are very good at being several things at once. Monte da Coddi fits that pattern beautifully. It is a monument that seems to stand at a crossing point. It is not a typical Western European megalithic tomb, though it belongs to a world that knew megaliths and tombs. It is not a Mesopotamian ziggurat, though it resembles the broad idea of a raised sacred platform. It is not Nuragic, though later Sardinia would become famous for monumental stone architecture. It is earlier, stranger, and more singular. It sits between categories the way Sardinia sits between shores. That may be why people struggle to describe it without borrowing words from elsewhere. Calling it an altar is useful. Calling it ziggurat-like is visually helpful. Calling it unique is accurate enough, though uniqueness can sometimes feel like a polite way of saying, we're still trying to work this out. The island setting also changes how we think about sacred landscapes. On a continent, a monument can be part of a wide land network stretching in many directions. On an island, the relationship between land and sea is more immediate. The horizon is not just scenery. It is the edge of the known world and the path to other worlds. For prehistoric Sardinians, the sea may have brought obsidian exchange, occasional visitors, new materials, and perhaps stories of distant places. But it also surrounded the island with a powerful natural boundary. A sacred centre like Monte may have helped organise life within that boundary. It gave people a fixed point on land in a world where movement across water was possible but uncertain. It is useful to imagine the island not as a single uniform culture, but as a patchwork of communities connected by paths, kinship, exchange, ritual obligations and shared symbols. People in different parts of Sardinia would have known different landscapes: uplands, plains, coasts, caves, valleys, forests and grazing lands. They may not all have used Monte in the same way, or even known it directly. But the site seems to have had significance beyond a single household. Its scale suggests community effort. Its setting near settlement and funerary areas suggests repeated use. Its unusual form suggests a place meant to be noticed. In an island society, such a monument could act as a centre, not necessarily political in the later sense, but social and ritual, drawing people together at certain times and giving shared practices a visible home. This is where the idea of Sardinia between worlds becomes very practical. The island was between the world of the living and the dead, at least in the way its pre-Nuragic tombs and sanctuaries organised space. It was between land and sea in its geography. It was between local tradition and outside contact in its material culture. It was between the Neolithic farming world and the later Bronze Age Nuragic world in its chronology. And Monte sits within all those thresholds. It is a place built on a boundary of meanings, not in a mystical way that requires us to invent more than we know, but in a concrete archaeological sense. It combines village life, burial landscapes, ritual stones, offerings, construction phases, and an architectural form that resists easy classification. The later Nuragic period can make Sardinia seem as if its prehistoric identity begins with towers. Thousands of nuraghes spread across the island, and they are so impressive that they tend to pull attention toward themselves like ancient stone magnets. But Monte reminds us that Sardinia's deep history was already rich before that. The island had already seen communities capable of symbolic architecture, long-distance exchange, complex burial traditions and ceremonial centres. The Nuragic world did not emerge from emptiness. It grew out of older Sardinian traditions, even if the exact lines of continuity are complicated. A culture does not wake up one morning and decide to become monumental. It learns monumentality slowly through earlier experiments in stone, earth, ritual, memory, and power. Monte may be one of those experiments. It does not look forward to nuraghe in a direct architectural sense. A ramped altar and a stone tower are very different things, but both show that Sardinian communities understood how architecture could organise attention and identity. Both show that stone could do more than shelter people. It could make statements, it could mark places, it could hold authority. It could turn the landscape into a memory system. The pre-Nuragic platform and the later Nuragic towers are not the same story, but they belong to the same island habit of making the land speak through built forms. What is especially interesting is that Monte does not seem defensive. The later nuraghe are often discussed in relation to control, settlement, visibility, defence, or social organisation, though their functions are still debated. Monte by contrast, feels open. Its ramp does not protect, it invites or directs. Its platform does not hide, it displays. Its surrounding stones do not fortify, they mark. This difference tells us something about the older world. The concerns of the people who built Monte da Codi may have centered less on defense and more on ritual gathering, offerings, memory, and sacred authority. That does not mean life was peaceful or simple. Prehistoric communities could compete, and no one should imagine the Neolithic as a long picnic with pottery. But the monument's form suggests that its main purpose was not to keep people out. It was to bring certain people in, or at least bring their attention to the right place. Sardinia's position between worlds also helps explain why Monte da Codi can feel both familiar and unfamiliar. We recognise parts of it. The menhir belongs to a broad European habit of raising stones. The offering tables fit a general pattern of ritual surfaces. The red ochre recalls many prehistoric symbolic uses of colour. The platform resembles distant sacred terraces. The village and tombs connect it to everyday life and death. Each element has parallels somewhere. Yet the combination is rare. That is often how distinctive cultures work. They do not always invent every ingredient from nothing. They combine familiar ingredients in unfamiliar ways. A meal can be entirely local even if salt came from one place, grain from another, and the cooking method from someone's grandmother who swore no one else did it properly. The movement of ideas across the Mediterranean would not have required direct contact with the great civilizations of the Near East for Sardinia to develop complex sacred architecture. Ideas can move through many steps, altered each time. A motif from one region may travel to another, lose its original meaning, gain a new one, and appear centuries later in a form no longer recognizable to its first users. But it is equally possible that Monte da Codi developed from local needs and local ritual logic, with only broad Mediterranean patterns in the background. The honest position is to leave room for both contact and independence. Sardinia was connected enough for influences to matter, and distinct enough for local invention to be powerful. There is a kind of humility in accepting that. Modern people often like clean origins. We want to say this came from there, that came from here, and this shape was copied from that one. Clean lines feel satisfying. But the ancient Mediterranean was not a classroom diagram. It was a moving, uneven world of small communities, shifting contacts, remembered traditions, experiments, practical needs, and symbolic choices. The origins of a structure like Monte da Codi may not be one line. They may be several threads, some local, some shared, some lost. To understand the island between worlds, we have to let history be less tidy than a map. The sea itself would have shaped imagination. Even if most people did not travel far, they lived with the knowledge that beyond the horizon there were other lands. Objects could arrive from elsewhere. Stories could arrive with them. A piece of obsidian leaving Sardinia proved that the island mattered beyond its shores. A foreign object arriving in Sardinia proved that the outside world could enter. The coast was not just an edge, it was a meeting line. Inland sites like Monte da Codi were still part of that broader island experience, because no part of an island is entirely separate from the fact of being surrounded by sea. The horizon becomes part of the mind. And yet Monte da Codi is not on a ship route in any obvious visible way as a harbour monument would be. It stands on land connected to settlement and burial. This tells us that the island's identity was not only maritime. Sardinia was not just a stepping stone between other places. It was a home. Its people shaped its interior landscapes, not simply its coasts. They carved tombs into rock, farmed plains, used uplands, built sanctuaries, and developed traditions that made sense within the island itself. Being between worlds did not make Sardinia empty space between more important regions. It made Sardinia a world of its own, with doors opening in several directions. That may be the most important correction. Monte da Codi does not matter because it proves Sardinia was influenced by somewhere greater. It matters because it proves Sardinia's prehistoric communities were part of the wider human story of monument building, ritual creativity, and social organisation. They were not peripheral to history just because they lived on an island in the Western Mediterranean. They made choices. They built a sacred platform unlike anything else nearby. They carried forward older traditions and perhaps responded to wider currents. They left behind a structure that still makes archaeologists careful and visitors curious. That is not the mark of a passive place. It is the mark of a culture actively shaping its own world. As the Mediterranean changed in later millennia, Sardinia would continue to stand between worlds. Phoenicians would come, Carthaginians would come, Romans would come, traders, soldiers, farmers, sailors, and administrators would all add their layers. But Monte de Codi belongs to a time before those named arrivals, before alphabetic records, before classical maps, before the island became part of histories written by outsiders. It is older than those stories, and because it is older, it gives Sardinia a voice from before the loud empires, not a voice in words, but in construction. It says that people here were already making sacred landscapes, already organising labour, already looking at earth and sky and deciding that a certain place needed to rise. This makes the monument feel less out of place. At first, it seems not to belong in Europe because it does not match the simplest image of prehistoric Europe. But once Sardinia is seen as an island between worlds, the surprise becomes more understandable. The Mediterranean was full of crossings, experiments, and local responses. Sardinia was distinct but connected. Its people were rooted but not unreachable. Monte de Codi is therefore not an impossible object, it is a rare one. Rare things do not break history. They make history more accurate by reminding us that the past was never as uniform as we hoped, and so the island becomes part of the answer to the monument. The ramp and altar tell us about ritual. The stones and offerings tell us about ceremony. The older red temple tells us about continuity and rebuilding. But Sardinia itself tells us why such a strange form could exist where it does. An island can preserve deep local traditions while still receiving distant influences. It can stand apart and still participate. It can make something that looks familiar from far away and yet belongs completely to its own soil. Monte de Codi is not a visitor from another world. It is the product of an island that had always lived with more than one horizon. By now, the structure begins to feel less like an anomaly and more like a meeting point. It gathers the earth beneath it, the sky above it, the dead around it, the living before it, and the sea-connected world beyond it. That does not solve every mystery, but it gives the mystery a proper setting. The platform is strange because Sardinia's prehistory was rich enough to produce strange things. The resemblance to distant monuments matters because people across the ancient world found different ways to raise sacred places above daily life. The island setting matters because Sardinia was never only isolated and never only connected. It was both, and that combination can produce forms that surprise us. As we come closer to the end of this journey, Monte de Codi no longer needs to be forced into a single explanation. It can remain what the evidence allows it to be, a prehistoric Sardinian sanctuary, unique in the Western Mediterranean, shaped by local traditions and perhaps touched by wider currents, built by people whose names are gone but whose decisions still stand in the open air. The island between worlds gave them the ground, the materials, the horizon and the setting. They gave the island a raised place that still asks to be approached slowly, and from here the last step is not toward another theory, but toward what the monument still leaves with us when the questions have quieted and the stones are left beneath the Sardinian sky. By the time we step back from Monte de Codi, the monument has changed a little in our minds. At first it seemed like a strange object in the wrong place, a structure in Sardinia that looked as if it had wandered out of a different ancient world and settled down in a field near Sassari without explaining itself to anyone. But after walking around it slowly through the ramp, the platform, the stones, the older red sanctuary, the people who built it and the island that held it, it begins to feel less like an outsider and more like a very old local voice speaking in a form we did not expect. It does not belong in Europe if Europe means only the simple version of prehistory we sometimes carry around in our heads. Stone circles here, tombs there, farmers waiting quietly for the Bronze Age. But if Europe means a wide, varied, sea-connected, inventive prehistoric world, then Monte de Codi belongs completely. It belongs exactly where it is. on Sardinian earth, under Sardinian light, still holding its shape after thousands of years of wind, soil, forgetting and rediscovery. There is something quietly satisfying about that. The monument has not really moved. Our understanding has. The platform is still a platform, the ramp is still a ramp. The stones still stand or rest where archaeology and restoration have left them visible. But the more we know, the less it feels like a random oddity. It becomes a meeting point between earth and sky, between the living and the dead, between local tradition and wider Mediterranean currents, between what archaeology can say and what it must leave unsaid. That is often how ancient places work. They do not answer every question. They train us to ask more careful ones. Monte de Codi still whispers because it was made by people who had no idea we would be listening. They were not building for tourists, documentaries, aerial photography, academic debates, or the slightly sleepy curiosity of someone watching from a sofa many thousands of years later. They were building for their own world. They built because the place mattered to them. They built because ceremonies needed a setting. They built because memory needed a shape. They built because the old sanctuary remained important, even after fire, change, or time forced them to rebuild. They built because communities need centres, and because human beings have always found ways to make certain places different from all the others. That may be the simplest thing Monte de Codi still says. Some places are not ordinary, not because the stones themselves are magical in any easy sense, and not because every ancient monument must be wrapped in mystery until common sense runs away politely, but because people made them matter. A field becomes a sanctuary because people return to it. A stone becomes a marker because someone raises it, and others remember why. A ramp becomes ceremonial because feet pass along it in a certain order, at certain times, carrying certain objects, following rules that may have been obvious to everyone there and are now lost to us. Meaning is not always something hidden inside a monument like treasure in a box. Sometimes meaning is the long history of actions repeated around it. This is why the silence of Monte de Codi feels so full. It is not the silence of an empty place. It is the silence left after voices have gone. No one is standing at the top of the platform now, preparing an offering or watching a procession approach. No one is carrying animals, vessels, food, or sacred objects up the ramp. No one is tending the red-plastered sanctuary beneath the later construction. No one is arranging stones, pouring liquid into cup marks, or gathering families near the surrounding huts. The gestures are gone, but the setting remains, and sometimes a setting can outlast the ceremony well enough for us to sense the outline of what has disappeared. Of course, we should be honest. We do not know everything. We do not know the names of the builders. We do not know their language. We do not know what they called the place, or whether the name we use now would have meant anything to them at all. We do not know the exact words spoken there, the stories told to children about it, the arguments that may have happened during construction, or whether someone looked at the length of the ramp and thought, privately, that this was getting a bit ambitious. We do not know whether the main ceremonies were tied to planting, harvest, birth, death, ancestors, sky cycles, divine powers, community gatherings, or all of these woven together in a way that made perfect sense to them and very little sense to us. The responsible answer has to leave room for uncertainty. But uncertainty is not failure. It is part of the honest texture of deep history. When a place is 5,000 years old, we're not entitled to every detail. Archaeology gives us what survives: stone, soil, dates, shapes, fragments, traces of burning, bones, pigment, tools, pottery, positions, layers. From these, we can build careful interpretations. We can say that Monte de Codi was a pre-Nuragic sanctuary. We can say that it had at least two major building phases, including the earlier red-plastered structure beneath the later raised altar. We can say that it was surrounded by ritual and settlement features. We can say that it is unique in the Western Mediterranean. We can say that it resembles in broad form sacred raised platforms known from elsewhere, especially Mesopotamian ziggurats, while also being clearly rooted in Sardinian prehistory. What we cannot say is that one final explanation has locked the monument shut. The door remains open, and perhaps that is why people keep walking toward it. There is also a useful lesson in how easily we mistake the unfamiliar for the misplaced. Monte da Codi seems not to belong because we expect the past to behave according to our categories. We want ancient Europe to look a certain way, ancient Sardinia to look a certain way, sacred monuments to fall into known types, and island societies to fit neatly between isolation and contact. But the past is not obligated to be tidy. It has never been especially interested in our filing systems. People build what their own world requires, not what future summaries will find convenient. Monte da Codi is inconvenient in the best possible way. It makes the map more interesting. It interrupts the simple version. It reminds us that prehistoric communities were capable of ideas we did not expect, an architecture that does not wait for permission from our timelines. And this may be one reason the monument feels so alive in the imagination. It is not grand in the way a cathedral is grand. It is not decorated with inscriptions or statues that tell stories in familiar forms. It does not overwhelm with height. It does not sparkle unless the Sardinian sun is being especially cooperative. Its power is slower. You have to give it time. You have to let the broad shape settle in. You have to imagine the earlier sanctuary beneath the visible one. You have to picture people returning to the site across generations, each generation inheriting the same raised place, but perhaps understanding it slightly differently. A monument like this does not impress by shouting. It impresses by remaining. Remaining is no small thing. Most human actions vanish quickly. A conversation disappears as soon as it is spoken. A meal is gone by morning, unless the dishes are left in the sink as a small domestic monument to procrastination. Footsteps fade, bodies age, houses collapse, fields change, even memories blur. But stone, earth, and deliberate construction can hold a trace for a very long time. Not the whole life, not the whole belief system, not the whole voice of a people, but enough. Enough to make us stop. Enough to ask why. Enough to feel the distance between our lives and theirs, and also the connection. Because in the end, the builders of Monte da Codi were not strange because they were ancient. They were familiar because they were human. They lived in a world of needs and uncertainties. They dealt with food, weather, animals, birth, death, community, memory, and the difficult business of making sense of forces larger than themselves. We do the same, though with different tools and far more notifications. They raised a platform. We build memorials, churches, town halls, observatories, museums, and quiet places to sit. They marked stones. We placed names on plaques and dates on graves. They returned to a sacred place. We returned to family homes, old roads, favourite views, and places where something important happened. The materials change. The impulse remains. That does not mean we should make them just like us. They have their own world, and we should let it remain strange where it is strange. But the distance is not total. A ramp is still something a body understands. A raised place still changes the feeling of a gathering. A stone set upright still draws attention. Red pigment still catches the eye. A place associated with the dead still makes the living behave differently. These are simple human responses, and they allow us to approach the monument without pretending to solve it completely. We can stand at the edge of the ramp and understand, at least in our bodies, that this was a place of approach. Perhaps that is what Monte da Codi still whispers most clearly. Approach slowly. Do not rush toward the dramatic answer. Do not flatten the site into a nickname, even a tempting one like the Sardinian ziggurat. Do not treat resemblance as proof or uniqueness, as an excuse for fantasy. Let the monument be unusual. Let it be Sardinian. Let it be connected to wider human patterns without stealing its local identity. Let the builders be skilled and thoughtful without requiring them to be part of a lost civilization from somewhere else. The real mystery is strong enough. It does not need to be made louder. And the real mystery is this. People once gathered in northern Sardinia and made a sacred height. They made it with earth and stone, with planning and labour, over an older red sanctuary that already held meaning. They placed stones around it, used offering surfaces, perhaps sacrificed animals, perhaps feasted, perhaps honoured the dead, perhaps called on powers of fertility, sky, earth, and ancestry. They came from a world before the Nuraghi, before writing on the island, before Rome, before the familiar histories that later filled the Mediterranean. And still, something they made remains visible enough for us to ask about them. That is not a small survival. That is a long bridge made of silence. So when we call Monte de' Codi ancient, we should remember what ancient really means here. Not merely old in a casual way, like a chair in the attic, or a forgotten tin at the back of a cupboard that should probably not be opened. Ancient means older than most of the stories that shaped Europe's later memory, older than the classical temples, older than the Roman roads, older than the Nuraghi that now define Sardinia's Bronze Age landscape. It reaches back into a period where written explanation is absent and material traces do the speaking. And even after all that time, the basic gesture is still clear. Build upward, gather here, mark this place, remember. There is comfort in that somehow. Not because the monument gives us certainty, but because it shows continuity in human behaviour. Across thousands of years, people have tried to make the invisible visible. A belief cannot be touched, so people build a place for it. A memory fades, so people attach it to stone. A community is fragile, so people gather around a shared centre. A fear is too large to hold alone, so people turn it into ritual. Monte de' Codi is one of those attempts, and it has lasted far longer than anyone who first carried material to the site could have imagined. Their world vanished, but their attempt to give meaning a place did not vanish completely. And now, here we are, far from them in time, looking back. You may be listening from a city apartment, a countryside bedroom, a train, a quiet kitchen, or somewhere half-lit by a screen in the late hours. You may be near Sardinia or on the other side of the world. You may know exactly what time it is, or you may be in that soft part of the evening where clocks become less persuasive and sleep begins making reasonable suggestions. Wherever you are, you've just spent a little while with a structure that has outlasted languages, cultures, fires, ceremonies, and the people who first knew what it meant. That is one of the quiet gifts of archaeology. It lets us borrow the company of distant lives for a short time. So before we close, I'll ask you gently, as we did at the beginning, where are you listening from tonight? And have you ever visited a place that felt older than its explanation? A ruin, a hill, a church, a stone, a path through a field, somewhere that made you feel history was not behind you but under your feet? Monte de' Codi has that quality. It is not only something to study, it is something to stand before. And even through photographs, plans, measurements, and careful interpretation, it keeps a little of that standing before it feeling. A pause, a narrowing of attention, a sense that the ground has been used for something more than walking. If this journey through ancient Sardinia has brought you a little calm, a little curiosity, or simply a good excuse to think about prehistoric architecture in a restful voice, I'd be grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, or shared it with someone who enjoys the quieter side of ancient mysteries. It helps this little corner of the world keep wandering through strange landscapes, deep time, old stones, and the kind of questions that do not need to be rushed. And Monte de' Codi is exactly that kind of question. It does not demand an answer before bedtime. It simply waits, broad and patient, with its ramp open to the sky. Maybe that is why the monument still holds us. It is not because it is the biggest, the most famous, or the most ornate. It is because it sits between categories. It is European, but not what many expect from Europe. It is Sardinian, but unlike anything else in Sardinia, it resembles faraway sacred platforms, But it is not simply one of them. It is ancient but still present. It is silent but not empty. And in that quiet uncertainty, it becomes memorable. The ancient structure does belong in Europe after all. It belongs there because the people of Europe's deep past were more varied, more inventive, and more connected than our simple stories often allow. It belongs in Sardinia because Sardinia was never just an island at the edge of things. It was a world with its own centres, its own sacred places, its own builders, its own dead, and its own horizons. Monte belongs because human beings there made it belong. They raised it from the earth, returned to it, rebuilt it, used it, and left it behind for time to cover and reveal again. And now, as the evening settles around us, we can leave it where it stands. The ramp no longer crowded, the altar no longer active, the stones no longer receiving the hands that once touched them. The Sardinian air moves over the site. The platform rests in the open land. The older red sanctuary remains hidden inside its later form. Around it, the island continues with roads, fields, towns, visitors, birds, weather, and the long ordinary life of the present. But beneath that present is the older place, still there, still asking its slow question, not loudly, not urgently, just enough for anyone willing to listen. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are tonight, and may the old stones keep their patient watch a little longer.